how you would die on every planet. This is you on Mercury. This is you on Saturn. And this is you in Uranus. What's the commonality between all of these versions of you? Well, they're all dead. And that's because basically every planet in our solar system is uninhabitable. But today, we're gonna explain exactly how you got to all of these planets and what about these planets caused you such a harsh and painful death. And to do that, let's take a couple steps back. Before you died on any of these planets, you are the bravest astronaut this side of the Mississippi. And NASA has decided that now is the time that we embark on interplanetary travel. Luckily for you, NASA has developed a special technology that has granted you the perfect number of respawns to die on every planet and still come back in one piece. Because after all, they know that you're just a squishy little guy. And these planets are pretty crazy. But without further ado, let's get to our first planet and experience just exactly how it would kill you. You're now officially approaching the very first planet in the entire solar system, Mercury. Instantly, you're met with two options. Do you land on the light side or do you land on the dark side? And although you're equipped with limited respawns, you understand that you have some wiggle room, and you decide to first land on the light side. One of the first things you notice as you descend closer and closer to the surface of Mercury is that you're experiencing very little atmospheric drag. And that's because there's actually no atmosphere on Mercury. Mercury only has a thin exosphere. When your rocket ship descends onto Earth, you notice the atmospheric drag and you feel the resistance. You can see the flames out of the window on the side of the ship. And that's because Earth has a strong atmosphere, but Mercury has no such thing, which already brings us to our first probable cause of death, which is a hard impact. Your spaceship isn't equipped for such a thin atmosphere, and for that reason, your landing is extra harsh. Although, miraculously, you and your ship survive. And you're now on the surface of Mercury. And before you even step out of your ship, you notice that the surface is bumpy and mountainous, and that's due to this lack of atmosphere. Just like how your ship experienced no atmospheric drag, meteorites don't either, meaning that they don't burn up when they enter the planet's exosphere. They keep going until they impact the ground hard, making the surface of Mercury look like an abandoned war zone. Regardless, you press the button, open the door, and you step foot onto the surface of Mercury. And within seconds, the spacesuit that your life depends on fails and begins to melt. The pressure that your spacesuit maintains to keep oxygen in the suit is gone due to burn holes that have appeared throughout the suit. And now you and your spacesuit are melting on the surface of Mercury, and before you're even able to gasp for air, your skin is boiling, your organs are shutting down, and you are dead before you can even asphyxiate from the lack of oxygen. That was probably quicker than you thought, but that's just the harsh reality of the light side of Mercury. Because Mercury has no atmosphere and a very thin exosphere, you are directly exposed to the harsh sun in full effect. And what that looks like, at least for the warm side of the planet, is temperatures approaching 427 degrees Celsius, which, like I mentioned, is enough to essentially cook you in seconds. But it doesn't just stop there, because not only does the lack of atmosphere not protect you from the sun's heat and radiation, but the lack of atmospheric pressure also means that the boiling point of water is significantly lower, which means that not only would all of your organs fail due to the sheer heat your body is experiencing, but also all of your bodily fluids would almost instantly evaporate. So yeah, the light side of Mercury is nothing to mess with, and the sheer unprotected exposure to the sun would kill, vaporize, and melt you in a matter of seconds. And even if it didn't, even if you were the most heat-resistant person in the world, there's also no oxygen, which kind of just seems like a cliff note at this point, but it is true, there's still no oxygen, even if you could survive this heat. You've respawned safely in your spaceship, and you've decided that you're just gonna wait for night to come to you. And you wait 1 hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. And at this point, you're curious if night's ever going to come. And the reality is, it likely won't come for a long time. And that's because Mercury rotates extremely slow, meaning that 1 day on Mercury is actually 176 days on Earth. So instead of waiting a half year for nighttime to come, you decide to fly your ship to the dark side of Mercury to see if that's any more inhabitable. Your ship lands and it's dark, although the lights on your ship and the distant glimmer of stars is enough to illuminate the surface of the planet for you to kind of walk around. You press the button, open the ship door, and take your first steps onto the surface of Mercury during nighttime. Instantly, you're relieved that you're not melting or having your blood boil, but you're now realizing what you are dealing with: a severe lack of heat. The nighttime temperatures on Mercury can get as low as negative 180 degrees Celsius, which may seem strange because this planet is the closest to the sun, but due to the lack of atmosphere, Mercury is very poorly insulated and not able to maintain and spread this heat across the planet, leaving you with almost only two extremes. After spending a few seconds on the surface, you realize that your spacesuit is once again not equipped for the sheer lack of heat, and you notice the cold to begin to penetrate your suit and cause severe internal damage. Your visor is instantly fogged up from your breath. Your nose, fingers, and toes are instantly turned numb and turning black with frostbite. At a molecular level, ice crystals are forming inside of your cells, causing internal damage, and your body is beginning to shut down. You can try to move around all you you want to try to generate more body heat, but it's simply not going to work. And even if your spacesuit is able to maintain pressure and give you oxygen, within a few minutes, hypothermia will set in and you will be dead. You once again respawn in your ship and realize that there is a third option for landing, a potential Goldilocks zone. You notice that the daytime is too harsh and the nighttime is too harsh. However, there is a strip in the middle of the planet where night meets day, and you decide to land there. Scientifically, and this is real, this area is known as the Terminator Zone, and it's the most moderate place on the entire planet, which is kind of ironic. Regardless, you fly to the Terminator Zone, you land, and you step out of the ship. The part of the Terminator Zone that you find yourself in is on the warm side, not the cold side. You're experiencing more of the sun exposure. However, it's not nearly to the same degree that you experienced on the daytime side, although this moderate temperature still far exceeds the temperature that your NASA spacesuit is able to tolerate. And I guess that this is a good time to mention, because in this hypothetical, we're using NASA's most current flagship spacesuit, which is rated to tolerate temperatures up to 121 degrees Celsius and as cold as negative 157 degrees Celsius, meaning that the suit definitely gives you a huge advantage over being, well, naked, but it's simply no match for the harsh conditions of Mercury. And for that reason, you once again find yourself dead within minutes. Leaving Mercury with your captain's logs full, you now make your way to the next planet in the solar system, Venus. Not to be confused with Penis. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, we're heading to Venus. Your ship is now orbiting Venus, and you begin your descent into this mysterious red-looking planet. As you descend closer to the surface of this planet, you can't help but notice the sheer opposites that you have just experienced. As you're descending closer to the surface of Venus, you are seeing clouds almost everywhere. Thick clouds at that. It's almost like a dark fog, and the closer you get to the surface of Venus, the darker things have become, which in contrast to Mercury is total night and day, because Mercury had no atmosphere, meaning no clouds, no air resistance, nothing. Venus, on the other hand, has an abundance of air pressure, meaning that your landing is relatively easy and light. But the pleasantries of Venus are about to end. Your ship gently lands on the surface and almost instantly begins to make creaking noises. These are noises you haven't yet heard from your ship, but you continue on. You press the button, open the bay door, and step onto the surface of Venus, where you're met with familiar and extremely unfamiliar problems. The first familiar problem is the extreme heat. The surface of Venus is actually hotter than the surface of Mercury, reaching temperatures of 464 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to melt lead. And because of this, like on Mercury, the integrity of your suit is compromised, you have lost all air, your skin is melting, your liquids are evaporating, and you are dead within seconds. But let's just say, hypothetically, if your suit was able to handle this amount of heat, well, you wouldn't last much longer at all. And that's because Venus has a very unique atmosphere. Atmospheric pressure is sometimes calculated in bar. And for example, on Earth at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 1 bar. If you've ever seen a watch that's waterproof, it might say 5 bar or something along those lines, and that just means it can tolerate higher pressure from being underwater. Well, the atmospheric pressure on Venus is 92 bar, meaning that its atmosphere is 92 times denser than Earth's. So even though Venus is a similar size to Earth and the gravity you would experience on this planet is relatively similar, because of the sheer atmospheric pressure, as soon as you step foot on this planet, your body would almost instantly collapse. This amount of atmospheric pressure is almost equivalent to being 1.6 kilometers under the ocean. But not only would movement be extremely hard and your body would even struggle to stand, but the sheer amount of pressure would also instantly rupture your eardrums and force all of the air out of your lungs. And if those things for some reason didn't kill you, the collapsing of all of your blood vessels definitely would. And as your dead body lays on the surface of Venus, it begins to rain. But this rain isn't any regular rain. This rain from the clouds that you saw is sulfuric acid, which at this point is basically just adding insult to injury. Because not only does your body essentially instantly vaporize, but it's also crushed and then melted by the acidic rain and fog that exists almost everywhere on this hellish planet. There's no Goldilocks zone or Terminator zone or good zone on Venus. It's all a thick fog of acid, extreme heat, extreme pressure, and it's extremely not fun. You respawn on your ship moments before the structural integrity of that collapses, and you begin your journey to your next planet. This planet looks familiar, but you just can't quite put your finger on it. You can see white, fluffy clouds from the atmosphere, huge, beautiful blue oceans, vast green landscapes, and vast brown deserts. You pick a random spot and decide to descend. The first place you decide to descend is an island just off the coast of India. You know that you're on Earth and realize that you likely don't even need your spacesuit, but you keep it on anyway. You press the button, open the door, and you walk onto this island off the coast of India. And instantly you realize that you're on North Sentinel Island. You try to turn around to get back to your ship, but you get an arrow through both of your knees. And before you can even say a prayer, you have been killed. And realize that maybe landing on North Sentinel Island wasn't the best place to land. You respawn in your ship, fly back up to orbit, and pick another location, this time on an island off the coast of Brazil, far away from India and any sort of uncontacted tribe, right? You land your ship, you open the door, and you step onto this island to realize that there's no people here at all. You can breathe. You take off your helmet and enjoy being home for once. Until you realize multiple snakes slithering up your legs, and you now have multiple venomous snakes in your spacesuit, and you're currently dying on Snake Island. You respawn in your ship, fly back up to orbit, and realize you're done. You're not going to any more uninhabited islands. You pick somewhere central in the United States and decide to land. You press the map, you open the door, and you realize that you've just landed in Gary, Indiana. You take your first few steps to admire the abandoned buildings. But before you know it, your spaceship is being stolen and sold for drugs, your space boots are being stolen off your feet, and you've just been stabbed for wearing a fancy-looking spacesuit. You lasted a noble 20 seconds. Obviously, I'm just being satirical here. There's more ways you could die on Earth than I could ever possibly mention. Although, if you did want to watch a couple videos about how you could die on Earth, there's a lot of videos on my channel that go into detail about that. You respawn in your spaceship, take a deep breath, and prepare for your next planet. You're approaching Mars, and already you're kind of scarred from red-looking planets, but you know that this planet is different, and you're excited to see how different this planet really is. You orbit the planet, and then begin your descent to the surface of Mars. Upon your descent, you're pleased to see that there is no sulfuric acid clouds or rain or gas anywhere, although you realize that's likely a result of the low atmospheric pressure that exists on Mars, and unfortunately, we now know the result of low atmospheric pressure. You have another harsh landing due to the lack of air resistance, and after the reddish dust settles from your impact, you open the door and take your first steps onto the surface of Mars. It's daytime, and you're pleasantly surprised because the temperature is extremely moderate. During the daytime, the temperature of Mars only gets to around 20 degrees Celsius, which is comfortable. Because of the distance that we now are from the sun, the temperature is not nearly as severe as it was on Mercury. However, there is still a big difference with the lack of atmosphere, and it's kind of twofold. The first issue is the radiation from the sun is still strong, 40 to 50 times stronger than it is on the Earth, which is concerning. And also, when nighttime comes and the heat from the sun is no longer available, the temperatures can get as cold as negative 153 degrees Celsius, which would kill you in a similar fashion as to what we explained before. But because we know how you would die on an extremely cold planet, and because you landed during the daytime on Mars, let's just discuss this situation. You're on the surface of Mars, the temperature is pleasant, and so far, things are looking good. Mars is the second most habitable planet in our solar system and is the most likely candidate to be a place where people could live, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's habitable at all. Besides the lack of atmosphere and extremely cold temperatures, Mars's air is almost solely comprised of carbon dioxide, which, if you try to breathe, would cause a panic attack and hypoxia and then suffocation, all within minutes. Although within your spacesuit, that's not an issue for now. However, what is an issue is the radiation exposure and severe sandstorms. And the sandstorms on Mars are intense. Winds can approach 100 kilometers per hour, and the abrasive nature of the sand could easily strip the paint off your spaceship, wear down your spacesuit, and essentially turn your helmet's visor from clear glass into frosted glass in a few minutes. But even still, you're not quite dead yet, and throughout the rest of the day on Mars, you could live, assuming you have at least enough oxygen in your spacesuit to explore the barren surface. Although, when night comes, temperatures will drop, and you will be no longer. You respawn on the ship and head off to your next planet. And this is the beginning of things getting really crazy. As you approach the next planet, you realize something different. This planet is massive. It's not only the biggest planet that we've explored so far, but it's also the biggest planet in the entire solar system. This planet is Jupiter, and as you begin to successfully orbit this planet, you realize something. You're experiencing radiation sickness, and that's because Jupiter is extremely toxic, and before you can even get anywhere near the surface of Jupiter, which we'll discuss that in a second, you are going to be feeling the effects of the extreme radiation that comes from this toxic planet. But assuming you and your suit are built different, you begin your descent into the planet of Jupiter. One of the first things that you're going to experience is the strange upper clouds. They're not made of sulfuric acid like on Venus. These clouds are lighter in color and composed of water vapor and ammonia. The temperature that we're already experiencing on the descent is already more than our suit can handle. But you're still in your ship and you're still safe for now. So you continue to descend. You notice things similar to Venus begin to get darker and darker, but more intensely than it did on Venus. And with that, you're also noticing that your ship is creaking, similar to what it did on Venus, meaning that the atmospheric pressure is getting intense. You would think that with Jupiter being so massive, its gravitational forces would be huge as well, but Jupiter's gravity is only about 2.4 times stronger than the gravity we experience here on Earth. As your descent continues and you're looking out the window, it's nearly pitch black and you can't see anything. Light isn't able to make it this deep onto the planet, and the pressure is getting intense. Even just 50 kilometers into the planet of Jupiter will have you experiencing pressure equivalent to around 1,000 bar. Keep in mind, the pressure on Venus was 92 bar. You're only 50 kilometers into Jupiter, and you're experiencing 1,000 bar pressure. Now, if you weren't in your indestructible ship, you would have frozen and been crushed into a ball long ago. But because you're in your ship, you're still continuing further. As the pressure increases and as you go deeper and deeper into the planet of Jupiter, one thing that you notice is peculiar is that it's no longer cold. It's actually hot, really hot. You notice that the temperature gauge on the outside of the ship is over 1,000 degrees Celsius, which, if you were exposed to, would instantly vaporize you. But because you're in your ship, you're still safe and still continuing deeper into the planet. At this point, you're struggling to decide when you can even get out of the ship and if you can at all. Because at this point, you've experienced extreme cold, extreme pressure, extreme heat, and now you're experiencing extreme storms with winds up to 400 kilometers per hour. And there's still no sign of any solid surface for you to land your ship on. You notice your ship reach something. It's not ground, but it's a liquidy surface, and it's good enough for you. You press the button, open the spaceship door, you step onto this surface of metallic hydrogen where your feet essentially get stuck and your body is instantly crushed and melted before you can even process what happened. Jupiter's a bit of a tough one because the deeper you go, the more hypothetical you get. And right now, the kind of going theory is that there is a core of metallic hydrogen and other heavy metals in liquid form, potentially surrounding a solid core, but also potentially not. The pressure and temperatures at the core of Jupiter are unimaginably intense. And in the instance of this experiment, this is as deep as you're gonna go, because your mission was to find out how you would die on Jupiter, not what the core of Jupiter is. Although that mission might have been a more productive mission to go on. However, right now the theory is actually that the core of Jupiter could potentially be hotter than the surface of the sun, which, if true, is just crazy to think about. But you don't have time to think, because you're already on your way to your next planet. And this planet, once again, poses brand new challenges. The challenges with surviving this planet begin with even getting close to it, because not only does Saturn have a plethora of moons, 146 as of now, but it also has its huge, massive, and cool rings, which are literally just orbiting pieces of older moons that crashed into each other or exploded for, I guess, other reasons. So before we even get close to this planet, we have a game of Space Invaders, avoiding asteroids and moon debris. But because you're a legend, you avoid all of that and you begin to get closer to Saturn, and you realize that you're going to be experiencing a lot of similarities to Jupiter. Specifically, because this planet is once again massive, and it's also comprised out of the same gases, helium and hydrogen. So you already know you're in for a world of pain. Literally a world of pain. Since the composition of Saturn is relatively similar to the composition of Jupiter, you decide that you're not going to wait until you reach some sort of core to get out of your spaceship. You're going to make sure that you're deep enough into the planet where it's dark and you know that you're fully immersed within the planet's contents, and then you're going to see what happens. And that's exactly what you did. You begin breaking through the initial clouds, and instantly you're once again met with ammonia crystals in the air and clouds and a thicker and denser fog. Your ship begins to descend slowly, your windows get covered in frost, and it begins to get darker and darker. And you realize that it's time to step out of the ship and see what happens. You press the button, the door opens, you step out, and you jump into the abyss. As soon as you step off of the ledge, you're not falling straight down. You are smacked by 1,800 km/h winds throwing you in multiple directions, as Saturn is experiencing consistent storms that would literally rip your body apart almost instantly. At this point, assuming you're extremely damaged but not killed, your body, flying around and spinning out of control, begins to fall deeper into Saturn. Already, the extreme cold is freezing you and killing you within your spacesuit, and the pressure is only getting more and more intense. But because on this particular day you were feeling extra resilient, you're able to survive these extremely cold temperatures and this wind and this intense pressure. You realize that the further you fall, once again, the warmer it gets. And the pressure only gets more and more bone crushing, until soon enough, your body lands into this metallic liquid surface, and your body is now literally a drop in the bucket. What used to be a human body in a spacesuit is now a vaporized liquid drop in an unbelievably hot core of a gas giant planet. You respawn in your ship. Fortunately, it's close to the surface. You exit this planet, make it through the minefield of moons and moon fragments once again, and you're out of the woods. You're no longer going into gas giants, but you're now getting into ice giants. And these planets aren't much better at all. And that's because they are still literally gas giants. They're not made of ice. They are just comprised of elements that are heavier than helium. And they are obviously extremely cold. Approaching the next planet in the first ice giant, you once again have to navigate a minefield of moon fragments. And once you've successfully navigated that, you are met with a beautiful sight. You look outside the window and bestow your eyes upon Uranus. Obviously, upon seeing it, the first thing you want to do is just get inside it. You need to penetrate Uranus to see what's inside, right? That's what this mission is all about. So before you could even orbit this planet, you simply begin to descend. And soon enough, you're penetrating the surface of Uranus. One of the first things that you notice is how dark it is at this part of the solar system. You are so far from the sun that even on the surface of Uranus, the surface level clouds, it is already pretty dark, and it's only gonna get darker the deeper you go. Upon penetrating Uranus, you're met with unbreathable and some toxic gases, with the majority of Uranus's atmosphere being comprised of hydrogen, helium, and methane, none of which are breathable for humans. But you've got your spacesuit on, and you're still in your ship, so you continue to dive deeper. It's not long before you notice the extreme cold, with temperatures already reaching negative 195 degrees Celsius, which, if you were outside, would be enough to almost instantly kill you. But you're still in your ship and still descending deeper into Uranus. And now you are getting into the heart of some of these storms happening on Uranus, with winds up to 900 kilometers per hour. Winds that could potentially be fatal and at the very least mess you up horribly. And as you continue to descend, it is extremely dark, the winds are horrible, and now your ship is being pelted, initially by ice-like crystals. And the deeper you go, you notice that these aren't crystals anymore. These are fully formed diamonds being pelted at your spaceship at over 900 kilometers per hour, something you haven't seen up until now. And at this moment, you're inspired to get out. You still haven't met any sort of solid surface yet, but you park your ship by hovering it, you press the button, and step out. You step into a 900 kilometer per hour gust of wind, and instantly are pelted with another gust of wind carrying diamonds in the opposite direction, going again 900 kilometers per hour, having your entire body be penetrated by these diamond fragments. And while you are dying and bleeding out and asphyxiating due to all of the holes in your spacesuit, you begin to notice the immense pressure crushing your body smaller and smaller in the intense heat that now exists at this deeper level. Uranus is regarded as the coldest planet in the solar system, but at this point, near the core of the planet, it is extremely hot, and you are being crushed, melted, vaporized, and pelted with diamonds. A fate quite similar to the last few you experienced, although this one at least includes diamonds, which is cool. But I think at this point, it's safe to say, playing in Uranus can definitely get dangerous. You're back on your ship, safe, and you're happy to be out of Uranus. So you quickly head to the final planet on this list, the second and final ice giant, that being Neptune. Now, I'll be honest, Neptune is extremely similar to Uranus as far as composition and what exactly would happen if you were to experience this planet. And because I can't make as many puns with this planet, I'm gonna keep this one relatively brief. Assuming you penetrate the surface of Neptune and decide to park the ship there and simply jump into the void, you would experience extremely cold temperatures, followed by extreme winds, and then rising temperatures and rising pressure until you are pelted by, once again, diamond rain, and then disintegrated into the darkness and abyss that is the core of Neptune. A story similar to the previous planets, but no less severe. Your death on Neptune, while instant, would be horrible. You respawn on your ship, and before heading back to Earth, you realize that you still have one respawn left. And because this is Trust Me Bro, and we're always extra, we decide to head to the forgotten planet of our lifetime. The dwarf planet that still exists in our solar system, but is no longer recognized as an official planet, and that would be Pluto. One of the first ways you could die in regards to Pluto is dying of boredom, because Pluto is so damn far away. But because we have Instagram Reels, you're able to entertain yourself for the entirety of the trip, and you are now orbiting the dwarf planet that nobody loves. You make your descent onto the surface of this planet, and you can only help but notice how small it is. It almost reminds you of the moon. But as you look back towards the sun, you notice something you haven't seen before. The sun, at this point, almost looks like a star in the distance. Sure, you can tell it's the sun, but it's at this point exceedingly small, and much smaller than it was when you were on Mercury. And speaking of Mercury, you notice once again that Pluto has almost no atmosphere, meaning that your landing was rough and you are in for some extremely strange experiences. Being this far from the sun means that it's dark and cold all of the time. And this is something that at this point, you're just prepared for. You hit the button and step into negative 229 degrees Celsius temperatures, a temperature that you may notice is actually colder than liquid nitrogen. And because the surface of this planet is colder than liquid nitrogen, you would essentially experience what it would feel like to jump into a pool of liquid nitrogen. Any liquid on or around your body would instantly be boiled, and your skin would feel like it's almost burning. We've reached temperatures so cold they feel hot once again. Your skin would freeze, and all of your flesh, including your muscles, your fat, your everything, begin to turn into a frigid, hard solid. Every cell in your body would die and turn black, and your dark, mummified body would essentially live on as a statue on the surface of Pluto, literally frozen in time. And my only hope for you would be that you left yourself in a funny position, if you even had time to get there. And with that, you use your last respawn, you get back in your ship, and you head back to Earth. You have multiple logbooks full of your experience being documented, and once you return to NASA and hand in this information, they regretfully inform you that they appreciate you going on this trip, but they actually just developed a drone that could have done all of this. And the worst part is, they actually developed it before you left. But because you seemed so excited about going, they didn't want to break your spirit, so they let you go anyway. But at least you got to play in Uranus. The most diabolical human experiments ever performed. The child and the ape experiment. Have you ever seen those cute videos of, new families, a young couple and they have a baby and they have a puppy and the puppy and the baby are playing together? Yeah, the ape and the child experiment is basically the worst possible version of that. This experiment takes place in 1931. It was conducted by a young couple, Winthrop and Luella Kellogg. And they recently just had a baby boy named Donald. And when Donald turned 10 months old, he had another sibling, not a brother, but a sister. However, this sister was not biological or even related by species. This sister that he was given was a 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gua. Winthrop Kellogg was a psychologist who specifically worked on the psychology of animals, primarily dolphins, rats, and birds. And him and his wife decided that it would be best to take their work home and to up the ante by not only experimenting with a chimpanzee, but also by effect their own child. The couple planned on documenting this entire experiment that they were about to begin. And the specific point of this experiment was to study the environmental influence upon early behavior, which what that really meant was they wanted to see if they raised a baby and an ape the exact same way at the exact same time, if they could get a similar outcome. And you can probably already see where this is going. It's speculated that they initially thought that this experiment would be relatively harmless and that their child would simply be a baseline to refer to when it comes to early education. And only the chimpanzee would be tested on because only the chimpanzee was being treated differently, right? The child hanging out with the chimpanzee wasn't going to be affected by this. Well, I won't spoil it, but it wasn't fully accurate. Interestingly, the Kellogg's thought they were doing the moral thing because initially they actually wanted to test the opposite. They wanted to see what the effects of having a child grow up in the wild would be. But because it's extremely dangerous and unethical to leave a baby in the woods, they were like, oh, well, why don't we just take an animal and put it in a human condition to see exactly how smart a chimpanzee can be and what their true natural potential would be if they were raised as a human. When you put it in that perspective, it may almost kind of seem logical, right? Regardless, after Donald and Gua were introduced, the tests began. And over the next 9 months, there was full-time grueling tests taking place between Gua and Donald to see exactly how a baby chimp and a baby human would compare and develop as they were both being treated the exact same as a normal baby would. Although, was Donald really being treated like a normal baby? They likely never had the time to ask that question because over these 9 months, there were so many experiments, tests, practices. There was literally no time to think about anything besides the daily tasks. Winthrop, during this time, literally took a leave of absence from his job to focus on this experiment full time and even moved his family down to Florida to be closer to the university where he had gotten this chimp and where he would be submitting his research. Now, after 9 months of daily testing and analysis, the experiment was mysteriously stopped. And while almost every aspect of this experiment was relatively well documented, the reason for why it stopped was not, which led to a bit of speculation. One primary belief is that they ended the experiment due to the rapid growth of Gua compared to Donald. Obviously, animals develop a lot faster than humans do, and in 9 months, Gua could have doubled or tripled in size, making her possibly dangerous to baby Donald. However, another leading theory is due to the fact that Donald was picking up more chimpanzee tendencies than the Kellogg's would have liked. And this is supported by some of the documents that the Kellogg's made. They even admitted near the end of the test that Donald was behind when it came to communication, and really only had a very small vocabulary of words and wasn't babbling much, and typically would only mimic the noises that Gua would make. Regardless of the reason, after 9 months, the experiment was closed. And while the experiment was well documented and completed at this point, the story doesn't end there. Because unfortunately, only a year after Gua was returned to the facility that she was taken from, she passed away from pneumonia. And Donald, on the other hand, was reported to have suffered from social and emotional issues through his young and adult life, and even ended up taking his own life at the age of 43. At this point, with the experiment basically being almost 100 years old, it's kind of up to speculation to try to understand if the parents knew that Donald would simply be a control for this test that they were doing, or if they knew that this experiment could potentially have detrimental side effects to their own child. But regardless, it happened, and now we know the consequences. And unsurprisingly, the ethics of this experiment were widely criticized, specifically because they used their own human child in such a strange and long-lasting experiment. And while some of the findings from this experiment did end up becoming useful in scientific research of animals and humans, one has to ask themselves, is it worth experimenting on your own child? Is it worth experimenting on any human? Is it worth experimenting on animals? That's a question I'll leave to you. Regardless, the child and the ape experiment is rather unfortunate. And if you can believe it, this is the most tame human experiment we're going to discuss in this list. They only get worse from here, and we're only just getting started. Let's move on. The Little Albert experiment. In the first experiment, we discussed a child who was not given the proper opportunity to develop like a normal child should, and unfortunately, they became a victim of that. Although in this experiment, we do discuss another child, however, they weren't just not given the opportunity to develop, they were forced to develop negative connections in their brain. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is literally a Pavlov experiment that took place on children, not dogs. Let me explain. The Little Albert experiment was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner and took place in 1920. And the point of the Little Albert experiment was to see if they could condition children to fear something that would typically not provoke fear. Already off to a great start. Watson famously claimed that if he was given 12 newborn children, he could condition them in their upbringing to turn them into any sort of person you could desire. A lawyer, a doctor, a murderer. Anything you wanted a person to be, you could condition them to become that during their early years. I definitely do not think we should be giving John B. Watson any children. Regardless, in the 1920s, somebody did. Watson was able to get his hands on a 9-month-old baby, known as Albert, for his experiment. Watson planned on using classical conditioning methods, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, because it was the same method that Pavlov used to condition dogs. The experiment began with little Albert being placed in a room. Watson, his partner, and a rat were all in this room together, and Watson and his partner simply watched how Albert and the rat would interact. At first, they weren't interested in each other until Albert decided to reach out and touch the white lab rat. It was at that point when Rosalie would strike a metal bar with a hammer, making a loud and scary noise, which would obviously upset Albert. And they would continue to do this time after time in this room every time Albert decided to reach out to the lab rat, until the point where Albert wanted nothing to do with this lab rat. Albert had associated this lab rat with a scary, unpleasant experience. And because of that, this lab rat that he was curious about, he was now afraid of. And not only now was this little Albert afraid of mice, but his fear began to become generalized. They learned this because after the experiment, when they handed Albert a teddy bear, Albert also rejected and gave the same reaction to this fluffy teddy bear that he did to the mouse. And it was theorized that at that point, it wasn't only the mouse that was triggering this negative reaction, but it was any fuzzy object that resembled the white mouse to this baby. Some examples were a white teddy bear, a white rabbit, a small dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. Fortunately, this specific experiment only had one victim, and that was little Albert. There was no control subjects, and the study basically ended there and the paper was published. And while that alone has obvious ethical flaws, once again, the story does not end there. Because Watson was now able to prove that he could condition a child, so what did he do next? Well, naturally, he decided to condition his own children. But he didn't condition his children for fear, but he did have some very interesting parenting philosophies. One of his most popular parenting philosophies was the thought that children should not be given too much attention. Watson believed that you should limit the amount of affection you showed your children. That meant during the day, limiting hugs, no kisses, minimal affirmation, and minimal attention. He literally said that you shouldn't play with your kids because it would disrupt their routine, as if children have routines. He also was a big proponent of sleep training, basically just letting your baby lay in the crib until it cries itself to sleep. Watson believed in all of this, and because he believed this and believed it to be good, he used all of these strategies on his 4 children that he had. Keep in mind, Watson claimed that if he was given newborn children, he could turn them into anything he wanted. So what do you think ended up happening to his 4 children? Let me tell you. Watson's son John suffered from unexplainable migraines and died in his early 50s. His daughter Mary struggled with alcohol abuse almost all of her adult life and attempted to take her life multiple times. Watson's other son James also attempted to take his life, and Watson's 4th child William did take his own life. Candidly, I'm not a parent, but I think it's safe to assume, based off this example and possible common sense, providing your children with a safe, loving environment is likely ideal for them to be raised into happy, healthy people. But what do I know? If you're a parent and you're watching this, let me know your thoughts on this experiment in the comments below. Regardless, the true identity of little Albert was never disclosed. It's unknown whether or not the parents of little Albert knew about the experiment. The long-term effects of this experiment that took place on little Albert are unknown and unfortunately are likely not good based off of the evidence we've seen. And Watson not only unsuccessfully raised his own children, but also also influence an entire generation on how to raise their children, which likely had an interesting impact on society. I think it's important to know that near the end of his life, Watson became rather reclusive and began to denounce a lot of his previous work, stating that he should have not made the books he did or made the claims that he had simply because he didn't have the knowledge yet. And it's even reported that he burned a lot of the physical copies of his experiments that he had in his personal study. You always want to assume the best in people, and maybe Watson just thought that if you gave your children too much affection, they would simply be attention-seeking, unhappy people. And for that reason, if that is truly the case, then it's unfortunate that he made such a detrimental mistake with those that likely meant the most to him. Although there is a very likely possibility that this person simply didn't care about the well-being of people and only wanted the scientific answer he was looking for. I know these entries were a bit similar, and for that reason, I wanted to put them together. Truthfully, I couldn't pick just one to add, so I decided to add both. And because this video gets darker and darker, they obviously had to go side by side. And if you're done hearing about childhood experiments, then buckle up, because this video is about to take a very dark turn. The Aversion Project. If you've watched our first video we made about conspiracy theories, then you'd probably remember me talking about the Canadian gaydar, which was essentially tests that the Canadian government developed to ensure that nobody in the military or police was gay, because if they were, then they were being fired. The Aversion Project was kind of like that, but only unthinkably worse. Like much, much, much worse. The Aversion Project took place in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, under the apartheid regime. This entire project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a military psychiatrist, and under his control, this entire project was actually carried out by the South African Defense Force, a massive military institution in South Africa. And in the South African military, there was actually a dual policy, which essentially stated that permanent members of the military were not able to be homosexual. You couldn't be gay if you were gonna stay. However, conscripts and temporary members of the military were allowed to be gay. But this isn't because they were a kind and tolerant bunch. The primary reason why this dual policy existed is because the South African military wanted to make sure that nobody was using homosexuality as an excuse to not join the army, which would have likely been very common because at the time, all white men in South Africa were required to serve a certain amount of years in the military. And the government thought if they banned homosexuality, obviously, then all these white men would just be claiming they're gay. Now here's the thing, it doesn't end there. The South African military might have allowed temporary members of the military to, join, as they were legally required to, but another thing they had to do if they were a temporary member of the military who was homosexual is they had to endure forced therapy. And of course, this wasn't talk therapy or to help people suffering from PTSD in the military. This was forced aversion therapy with electric shocks, castration, and even gender reassignment surgeries. The project's ultimate goal was to cure these homosexual military members while they were a member of the military and basically at the will of the military. And because of that, they forced them through psychological torture and medical procedures that they did not want to have done. And on top of this, they didn't just do this to people that admitted they were homosexual. They did this to people that they assumed were homosexual. Meaning that if you were a member of the military at this time, and people thought that you were being a bit fruity, or if people just didn't like you and wanted a good excuse to literally torture you, they would accuse you of being gay. And at that point, you could be subject to a laundry list of horrific experiments. Some of the most common things that were done were strapping down these alleged homosexuals and showing them homosexual images. Obviously, it doesn't end there. As they would show these victims homosexual images, they would then electrically shock the victim to try to create a negative connection in the brain towards same-sex relationships, which kind of ties into the Little Albert experiment. Which, on top of this shock therapy, some soldiers were chemically castrated by being given a concoction of chemicals that the doctors believed could potentially cure homosexuality, or at least all of their evil urges. And one less popular thing they did that still happened was forced gender reassignment surgeries, where these members of the military were literally subject to hormonal treatments and genital surgeries that would alter their sex against their will, which is disturbing and evil and almost ironic because they're like, okay, we're gonna take all of the gay people of the military, so we're gonna make them trans. Literally just insane. And it's estimated that anywhere from 500 to 1,000 young men and women were subject to these brutal procedures at the hands of the Aversion Project over the course of the apartheid. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror and agony that was likely being experienced by the victims at this time, but it's even harder to imagine the long-term effects of this essentially torture that took place on these people. There's no doubt that many of the victims that suffered this severe psychological and physical trauma had the rest of their lives altered forever. And specifically for the people that had their genitals mutilated unconsensually, for the percentage of those who survived the surgery, many of them went on to take their own life not long after. The apartheid ended in the 1990s, and the truly disturbing details of the Aversion Project came to light. And Dr. Levin knew he was about to be in big trouble, so he left South Africa and fled to Canada, where he, disturbingly, was able to continue his medical practice. That was until he ironically was was convicted of multiple sexual assaults on men. That's right, this person who had been mutilating homosexual and suspected homosexual men and women in South Africa himself was accused by over 30 men of sexual assault. And it was only at that point, after Levin was tried, that he was sentenced to 5 years, which he had already served and he's actually free again, and had his medical license suspended. This story and series of human experiments is truly diabolical. And on top of all of the pain and suffering and discrimination that took place in the South African military, it's almost mind-boggling to me that if Levin didn't assault people in Canada, he would be a free man, and that he served no time or had no legal repercussion for what he did in South Africa. However, I suppose logically it makes sense because in South Africa, what they were doing was legal. That was the law. If you were gay, you had to go to the military and you had to be cured, or at least treated. So crazy. But at least the story has a bit of a happy ending because evil people are gonna be evil. And while Levin had a get out of jail free card by going back to Canada, he couldn't go at least a few days without hurting other people. 5 years for over 30 assaults of literal medical patients is not enough in my opinion. The Aversion Project is truly a dark chapter in medical and human rights history. And to this day, the story is a huge reminder of what's possible when you have unchecked power, non-existent morals, and state-backed medical abuse. Before we get to the final entry of this video, I wanted to list a few honorable mentions, or I suppose dishonorable mentions. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a truly diabolical human experiment, and if you want to learn about that, I actually talked about it in this video about American conspiracy theories. The monster study of 1939, I actually talked about in my first video about human experiments, and the Unit 731 experiment is likely one of the most diabolical human experiments to ever take place. And the only reason why it's not in this video is because I also talked about it in my last video. So I just wanted to address these quickly. Obviously, these are all diabolical human experiments. I'm just not talking about them in this video because I've already mentioned them in other videos. And while we're at it, I just want to say this as well. If you guys enjoyed this video about diabolical human experiments and want more, please let me know in the comments below. Your guys' support is always appreciated, and your feedback is always taken into consideration. But truthfully, I'm just procrastinating at this point because this final entry on the list is literally beyond diabolical. But I suppose let's just rip off the band-aid now. The Nazi medical experiments. This experiment isn't one experiment. It's an entire series of experiments that took place during World War II. And these Nazi medical experiments were carried out in concentration camps under the direction of high-ranking Nazi doctors, primarily Joseph Mengele, who was later known as the Angel of Death. There's a reason why I put this one last. It's important to note that Joseph Mengele was not the only doctor committing these atrocities we're about to get into. There was over a dozen doctors committing horrible human rights violations, and doing so in the name of science, but as you'll see, it's quite far from the truth. Joseph Mengele and the other Nazi doctors performed their experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which primarily housed Jewish and Romani people. And because the people in these camps were not even seen as humans, to the Nazis, they were essentially less than cattle, and the fact that they were coming in by the trainload every day meant that these doctors had an unlimited supply of research subjects that they could do anything they wanted to. And they took full advantage of this cruel, horrific opportunity. The reasons for these experiments varied greatly, from experimenting on people for the benefit of the military, all the way to personal leisure or interest. There was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments that were performed on these people by the Nazis to gain random pieces of knowledge. I literally can't explain every single one of them, although I will give a few examples of some of the things they did. One disturbing experiment that the Nazi Party did was they would take someone and then put them into a pressure chamber. A chamber that they could either add air pressure to or remove air pressure from to simulate altitude. And what they would do with these victims in the chamber is raise and drop the pressure significantly multiple times. And the reason they were doing this is to see the effects on the human body of quick altitude changes to further their research on what happens when people jump out of planes. Obviously an advantageous military strategy. The experience for the victim inside the chamber had to be horrific. And unfortunately, after cycles of high and low pressure, the doctors would then take these victims and autopsy them while they were still alive, because they wanted to monitor every part of the body while the heart was still beating. They did this one specific diabolical experiment to over 200 people, 80 of which died during the experiment, and the other 120 that survived were executed immediately after. Another disturbing human experiment that Nazis would do involved hyperthermia. They wanted to better understand how it worked and how to prevent it. And how they went about this was by subjecting people to intense conditions. For some examples, they would put people naked into freezing water, monitoring their vitals until they died of hypothermia. Other examples, they would put people in Nazi Nazi uniforms and then put them into cold water to see how effective the Nazi uniforms were at preventing hypothermia. And in some cases, they would put people naked in freezing conditions for up to 14 hours to see what would happen to these people. And for those who did survive the intense cold conditions, they would rewarm these people and then subject them to crazy conditions once again. And how they would rewarm these people varied from heat lamps to boiling water. Similar to the Unit 731 experiment, they also tested diseases, specifically injecting deadly diseases into people to see how they would affect them, and also performing live autopsies on these people so they could see the effects of the disease in real time. Almost all of the surgeries and experiments that were performed by the Nazis were performed without anesthesia, meaning that these victims felt almost every grueling detail of what was happening to them, whether it be a live autopsy, or being boiled alive, or having an experimental sterilization take place on your genitals. I think you get the point, but these Nazi medical experiments were insane. Joseph Mengele personally conducted experiments specifically on twins too, with some of the more common experiments having the goal of either changing eye colors or conjoining siblings by simply removing limbs and trying to connect the two people together. Like I said, I would need probably a multi-day long video to go through the entire list of crazy experiments that took place, but at the end of the day, the total goal of all of these Nazi medical experiments lined up basically with the Nazis' radical ideologies that they had. And the purpose of these experiments was to simply improve the survival chances of German soldiers at war and to find the most effective way to sterilize or exterminate people that weren't Aryan. I could go deeper into excruciating detail, but I truly think you get the idea. The experiments performed by these Nazi medical doctors were so detrimental and so well known that it forced these doctors to be tried during the Nuremberg trials, which individually varied in level of consequences, but in general led to a much stricter medical standard, including the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially a set of ethical principles that must be followed when conducting human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments were almost unspeakably disturbing, and I can only imagine the acts that didn't make it to the history books. And these human experiments that took place by the Nazis are likely only rivaled by the Unit 731 experiment for some of the most diabolical human experiments of all time. And for that reason, I knew I had to discuss it on this video. This video went from strange to upsetting to disgusting to disturbing extremely quick. But don't say I didn't warn you. It's almost mind-boggling the lengths that people are willing to go to in the name of scientific discovery. And while that almost may sound noble out of context, I think that this video, if nothing else, proved that there is a line and rules need to be enforced. The satisfying downfall of every major dictator. When you talk about some of the most evil dictators in all of modern history, most people reasonably focus on their crimes against humanity. However, people typically forget to mention exactly how these people were brought to justice or how they got away with it. And in this video, we're going to discuss exactly how every major dictator lost either their power or, in most cases, their life. Let's begin. Kim Jong-il. In 1994, Kim Jong-il became the ruler of North Korea when his father passed away. And what Kim Jong-il inherited from his father was a communist nation that was run with an iron fist, completely isolated from any outside sources, repressive in almost every sense of the word, and riddled with human rights violations. And Kim Jong-il gladly took this country and continued the tradition. And like any wild dictator, of course, he gave himself a crazy title. In this case, Kim Jong-il was the supreme leader of North Korea. Due to how secretive North Korea is, there's actually not much known about Kim Jong-il's early life, although it's speculated that he was born in 1941 on a Soviet military base near the Russia-North Korean border because that's where his father was stationed at the time. However, when Kim Jong-il became the supreme leader of North Korea, a lot of interesting facts were presented by the North Korean government about their new leader's past. Specifically, that he was born on February 16th, 1942 on top of North Korea's sacred Mount Pictu. But not only that he was born on top of this mountain, but when he was born, a new star appeared in the sky and a double rainbow appeared overhead. That claim alone is crazy, and keep in mind, this isn't hyperbole or metaphorical. They present this information as fact, and the North Korean citizens are meant to believe it. And even if they don't believe it, they better act like they believe it. But besides the crazy claims about his birth, there's also an endless supply of crazy claims around his achievements in his life. One of my favorites being that he made 11 holes in one in a single round of golf. Another being that he composed operas popular in China, and also that he invented an invisible cell phone and that he could literally control the weather. another. I feel bad for the North Korean citizens that blindly fell for all of this obvious propaganda, but I almost feel worse for those who saw through the propaganda and had to believe in a world that they knew was fake and there was nothing they could do about it. At least if you believed it, you were blissfully ignorant to the truth. Regardless, after Kim Jong-il grew to power, only a few years after Kim Jong-il was given power of all of North Korea, he was responsible for a series of famines that killed an estimated 2 million people from 1994 until 2000. And that is really only the beginning of the human rights violations that happened in North Korea during his supreme rule. But things started to change in the late 2000s, when Kim Jong-il was not seen in public places, specifically in the 2008 Olympics or in military demonstrations where he was always attending. Other countries started to suspect that Kim Jong-il was beginning to be in poor health or potentially even already dead, although the North Korean state media made it seem like everything was just fine and dandy. That was until December 17th, 2011, when Kim Jong-il was confirmed dead by the North Korean government. The North Korean government claimed that he died of overexertion because he was simply working so hard, making North Korea the best it could be for the people. But in reality, he likely just passed away from a heart attack. And following his death, there was a mandatory 11-day mourning period where everybody had to publicly look upset about the death. And Kim Jong-il's body was even placed on public display in a memorial palace in Pyongyang. This is the same palace where his father's body is also on permanent display. Following his death, his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, was given total control of this dictatorial regime. And as of today, he's still in power. But maybe in a future video, we can discuss his downfall as well. Hideki Tojo. Hideki was born and raised deep within the grips of imperialistic Japan. He was born in 1884 and began his education at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and then began his career in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1905. After spending time in the Japanese Army, he served as a military attaché in Germany, of all places, from 1919 until 1922, and from that point, over the next 15 to 20 years, he began quickly rising through the ranks of the Japanese military and Japanese government until October of 1941, when he was appointed the Prime Minister of Japan. Now, under a different context, that may seem like an impressive military and political career. However, the actions that took place under this man's rule is anything but impressive, and is truly nothing short of a nightmare. Hideki was the Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 until 1944 when, well, we'll get to that. And if you couldn't already tell, that was during the Second World War. And if you know anything about World War II in Japan, well, they weren't up to much good stuff. And some of the things attributed to Hideki's rule are the following: numerous war crimes, including the massacre and starvation of thousands of prisoners of war and millions of innocent civilians, the attack that happened on Pearl Harbor, which literally happened 2 months after he was appointed prime minister, and other numerous mass murders that happened in and out of Japan during his rule. And not to mention, before he was even prime minister, but still an extremely highly ranking military official, the whole Japanese invasion of China in 1937 happened, and that's a completely different can of worms, but just know that that was literally hell on earth as well. It's safe to say that a genocidal military appointed prime minister is really nothing short of a dictator. And even if you don't specifically classify him as a dictator, well, his resume doesn't make him any better than one. And on July 18th of 1944, Hideki actually resigned as prime minister, as the war was definitely not going Japan's way. After he resigned, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, and in September of 1945, Hideki was arrested. Following his arrest, he was put on trials in an international tribunal military court, where he was sentenced to death for numerous crimes against humanity and numerous war crimes. And on December 23rd, 1948, only 2 days before Christmas, Hideki was hung. And his reign of terror was over, but definitely not forgotten. Pol Pot. In the 1960s, in the Cambodian jungle, Pol Pot began to organize the Khmer Rouge, a group that advocated for a radical communist revolution to essentially wipe out any form of Western influence in Cambodia. In 1970, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge troops, along with North Vietnamese troops, began a large-scale insurgency against the Cambodian government. And through this insurgency, they were able to control a third of the entire country. And by April of 1975, only 5 years later, Khmer Rouge was able to capture the capital of Cambodia, overthrow the pro-US regime, and establish a new government, the Kampuchean People's Republic. Once Pol Pot was fully in power of Cambodia, the cities were evacuated, schools and factories were closed, and any form of private property or currency was abolished. And terrifyingly, anybody who is believed to be intellectual, such as somebody who was proficient in math or potentially spoke a foreign language, was immediately killed. Even if you were good at your job, just a skilled worker, you were also killed. But even if you weren't speaking other languages or particularly good at your job, if you even had any form of basic technology, such as glasses, a watch, or even maybe a little radio, you were once again killed. And because of this, from 1975 to 1978, it's estimated that over 2 million Cambodian people were killed by either execution or forced labor or famine. But in 1978 to 1979, Vietnamese troops were back in Cambodia, but this time to overthrow the Khmer Rouge because they saw how crazy things have gotten. And in 1979, Pol Pot and the remaining Khmer Rouge members retreated back into the Cambodian jungle. In 1985, Pol Pot officially retired from being the head of the Khmer Rouge, even though it was already at this point no longer controlling Cambodia and more or less of an entity that just existed in Cambodia. But even still, after his retirement, the Khmer Rouge still continued to take out guerrilla actions against the Cambodian government. But in 1997, Pol Pot was finally put on trial, and he was sentenced not to death, but to life in prison. And if you're not already upset, this is where things get really upsetting. Because although so many people wanted him to be extradited and sentenced to death, he not only just got life in prison, but he was also able to serve time in his home on house arrest. And a year after his trial in 1998, Pol Pot declared in an interview that, quote, "My conscience is clear." And later that year, he died in his home, peacefully in his sleep. Life is truly unfair. Some of the best people in the world are gone too soon in horrific ways. And others who kill millions of their own people get to live long lives and die peacefully in their sleep. Sometimes you just feel like justice truly wasn't served. Benito Mussolini. World War II is going to be a common theme in this video because unfortunately there was an abundance of dictators, but I'm going to sprinkle them throughout so it's not all at once. Early in Mussolini's career, he was a socialist politician and a journalist at a newspaper. And in 1912, he became a member of the National Directorate of the Italian Socialist Party, but was actually kicked out of that because he wanted military intervention in World War I. Because of this, in 1914, Mussolini founded his own newspaper and also served in the Royal Italian Army until he was wounded and discharged in 1917. After being removed from both political and military groups, he decided that the best next course of action was to start his own thing. And what he started was a fascist movement in Italy. In 1922, following the March on Rome, he was appointed as the prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III. And shortly after becoming the non-elected prime minister of a country, Mussolini, through the help of his secret police and his followers, were able to consolidate all of their power, transforming Italy into a one-party dictatorship. Within 5 years of being the appointed prime minister, Mussolini was able to establish a dictatorial authority by both illegal and legal means. And his goal was to create a totalitarian state. And if you're unfamiliar, totalitarianism is essentially just a political system that literally prohibits the opposition of the government, meaning that the government controls and owns everything and you cannot say anything about it. From his rise to power in 1922 to 1937, there was multiple wars and conflicts that Italy was involved in due to their new political structure. And in 1937, after the huge costs of all of the conflicts that they were involved in, they decided to preemptively join the Axis powers, specifically Germany and Japan. And this ended up being extremely helpful for Italy because they were completely unprepared for World War II. In July of 1943, when the Allied powers invaded Sicily, King Victor Emmanuel III, the person who initially appointed Mussolini, was now dethroning Mussolini and didn't only take his power but also put him in custody. But it didn't last long, as Germany was able to successfully rescue Mussolini, and Mustache Man from Germany made Mussolini a ruler of a not-so-official puppet state that was just a German-occupied part of northern Italy, which was known as the Italian Social Republic. But when Germany and Italy and the Axis powers began to fall, and it was obvious that the Axis powers were no longer going to win World War II, Mussolini and his mistress at the time attempted to fully flee Italy and go to Switzerland to essentially go into hiding. While en route to Switzerland, the pair stopped near Lake Como with a group of other fascists and German soldiers, basically right on the border of Switzerland. During this brief break on their escape, Mussolini was actually trying to be incognito, and how he did so was by dressing up as a German soldier, which, you know, you're a bad guy if you're disguised as a German soldier. But even with this disguise, it didn't help him, because Italian partisans saw him and killed him and his girlfriend essentially on sight. They recognized him, and at that point, Mussolini no longer existed. Nicolae Ceausescu. Born in 1918, Nicolae was born to be a politician. As a child, he was a member of the Romanian Communist Youth Movement, and as a young adult, he found himself rising through the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party. And when the previous leader of that communist government died in 1965, Nicolae was handed the torch, and he became the Romanian Communist Party General Secretary. And from being declared General Secretary in 1965, he was able to gain power, and in 1974, only 9 years later, declare himself as the Romanian president, which essentially gave him total control of the entire country of Romania. When somebody grants themselves total control of an entire country, it's not hard to believe that they would start easing in things like censorship of the press and totalitarian rule, something we discussed earlier. And it got so bad that at the time it was considered one of the most repressive governments in all of Europe. Nicolae had secret police that were responsible for mass surveillance and even mass repression of human rights abuses that were happening in the country. And because of his censorship of the press, a lot of the things that were going on within the country were not able to be spread within or outside of the country either. There was a time when Nikolaya was actually popular, although his popularity was extremely brief and unstable. And during the late 1970s, while he was the president, his mismanagement led to massive debts for the country of Romania. And in 1982, Nikolaya forced the Romanian government to export way too much of the country's agricultural resources in order to help pay these debts, which obviously put pressure on the citizens of Romania. Fast forward to 1989, only 7 years later, anti-government protesters are popping up all over the place. And Nikolaya saw these demonstrations as a political threat and ordered the military to open fire on these demonstrators, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries. And because of this action, the people could no longer take it, and massive widespread rioting and civil unrest roared across the entire country of Romania and sparked the Romanian Revolution. It got to the point where demonstrators were breaking into the Capitol building of Romania, and Nikolaya and his wife fled from the roof of the building on a helicopter, although the military forced them to land, and they were arrested, tried, and convicted of economic sabotage and genocide. And the couple were sentenced to death immediately, and both Nikolaya and his wife were executed via a firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989. Joseph Stalin. Stalin was born to a poor Georgian family in the Russian Empire, and as a young adult joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, while at the same time he was also helping raise funds for Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction, and how he was donating to this faction was actually by committing bank robberies and other crimes, as well as editing the party's newspaper. Already off to a good start. Because of his crimes, he was repeatedly arrested, where he was exiled to Serbia multiple times. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Stalin served as a member of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Very quick and easy name. And from 1922 onward, he used his position as General Secretary to gain control over the entire party. After Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was the new man in charge. And Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country became central to the party's ideology. And while he was now in power and had grand plans for the Soviet Union, it didn't really work out in his favor, because due to his poor policies, natural disasters, increased demand for food because of urbanization caused by his poor policy, a nationwide famine took place from 1932 till 1933 and killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. But that's not all. Only 3 years later, between 1936 and 1938, Stalin executed hundreds of thousands of confirmed and potential political opponents in what was called the Great Purge. And on top of that, under his regime, an estimated 18 million people were processed through the Gulag system of forced labor camps, which was essentially hell on earth. Keep in mind, all of this took place after World War I and before World War II. Of course, then World War II happens, which is an entirely separate can of worms, which is beyond the scope of this video at this point. But to put it in short, after World War II, the dust had settled and people were happy that, the Axis powers were defeated, but there was still one issue. Western countries wanted capitalism, and the Soviet Union did not, which obviously eventually led to the Cold War, but during this time led to a lot of unease surrounding how things were going to be rebuilt post-World War II. One thing that the Soviet Union decided to do was to build their own nuclear bomb, which they tested in 1949. But unfortunately, during the same year, the country was also experiencing another famine. And on top of that, they also had a state-enforced campaign that killed both Jewish people and intelligent people called the Doctor's Plot. But here's the thing, despite all of the things I mentioned, specifically within the Soviet Union, Stalin was seen in a relatively positive light. He had a cult of personality, he led the Marxist-Leninist movement, and by his followers, he seemed to be the champion of socialism and the man of the working class, although millions of them died. Regardless, at the time, Stalin was relatively popular, and even to this day, in post-Soviet countries, there are old people that still remember times before the Soviet Union fell, where they look at those times fondly, and they miss those times, and they wish that the Soviet Union was reestablished, which is unfortunate because a lot of the countries that are now post-Soviet are riddled with corruption, not allowing them to actually prosper in a capitalistic society. But that's completely beyond the scope of this video. Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74 on March 5th, 1953. He passed away in his personal residence after suffering a stroke. But even though he was now dead, mass murders caused by him didn't stop. What I mean is, following Stalin's death, there was massive funeral celebrations that took place. Like I mentioned, he was relatively popular within the Soviet Union. And because of this, hundreds of thousands of people attended his multi-day funeral. And unfortunately, because of people being so excited or simply so cramped and a lack of fire regulation, at least 109 people were confirmed to have been killed in a crowd crush that took place at the funerals. And it's estimated that it's completely possible that over 1,000 people in total died because of the funeral services that took place. This is one of the more interesting situations we've talked talked about so far, because at this point, no other dictator was still fully in control and still relatively popular at the time of their death. Up until Stalin, every other dictator either had to go into hiding to die peacefully or was executed. So this one was interesting. What else is interesting is the fact that I post videos every week. Feel free to subscribe. Let's move on. Saddam Hussein. We actually already discussed Saddam Hussein 2 videos ago in our video about bad people that did good things, but in this video, we're not going to discuss any of his good deeds at all. As an adolescent, Saddam attended a nationalistic high school in Baghdad, and after high school, Saddam studied at an Iraqi law school for 3 years when he dropped out in 1957. At that point, he joined the Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, basically the Iraqi regional branch of the Arab Socialist Party. Interestingly, during his rise to power, Saddam was actually involved in an assassination conspiracy to kill Qasim al-Rashid, who opposed the notion of Pan-Arabism. Although during the assassination attempt, Saddam, who was supposed to provide cover to the other shooters, actually began shooting first, which ended up disorganizing the entire operation, and the person they were trying to assassinate was only hit in the arm and survived. Interestingly, although this assassination attempt was failed, the party that Saddam was a part of, which only had less than 1,000 members, was now gaining widespread coverage and attention because of the attempt. But interestingly, this wasn't necessarily bad publicity. It didn't stop his future political career at all. And he spent the following years in jail, conniving with other small political groups, theorizing other assassination attempts, and ultimately participating in coups. Which brings us to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Saddam has built himself a reputation of being a progressive and effective politician. And because of this, he found himself becoming the vice president. And he was vice president during the 1973 energy crisis that saw oil prices skyrocketing, which directly benefited Iraq because they were, of course, selling that oil. And with this extra revenue, they were able to help revitalize and strengthen Iraq, pulling people out of poverty and developing and industrializing the country. But, of course, his time as vice president and as president is not without its many, many flaws. For example, the use of mustard gas and nerve gas on innocent civilians, which resulted in thousands and thousands of deaths. The Due Jail massacre, which took place in 1982 under his rule, which resulted in the execution of 148 men and boys. And on top of both of these things, just general blatant disregard for international law and numerous violations of international borders, some of which were actually subsidized by other countries because Iraq was dealing with the Iranians and Kuwait. Some countries kind of overlooked the war crimes of chemical warfare to help support Iraq because they were fighting with Iran. And by countries that were supporting this, I mean the United States and the United Kingdom. Throughout the entirety of his rule, the divide in Iraq was massive. Some people seeing him as a hero and a great leader, others seeing him as a horrible dictator, and it really all depended on what tribe you belonged to. But in March of 2003, the US invaded Iraq, ending his nearly 24-year regime, which was at this point internationally known for repression, brutal purges, and massive violence used to maintain absolute power. Just classic dictator stuff. And during this US invasion in the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Saddam Hussein went into hiding, but he was caught only a few months later when US forces found an underground bunker. After Saddam was captured, he was held in the States and then transferred back to Iraq, where he was put on trial for a lot of the crimes he committed as president, specifically the attack I mentioned in 1982. This trial ended on November 5th, 2006, and Saddam was found guilty and was sentenced to death by hanging. And interestingly, this hanging took place during the Islamic holiday of Eid, which is odd because we also discussed an execution that happened earlier that took place on Christmas. I'm not sure if that's just how the dates lined up or if that was intentional, but regardless, it happened. And a video was actually taken of the execution by somebody who recorded it on their cell phone. And this video was leaked and widespread online and on the news. And as I mentioned, depending on who you were, this execution was seen as justice finally being served or a massive injustice, all depending on what you believed and which tribe you belonged to. Interestingly, Saddam actually requested and tried hard to be executed via firing squad, but in court, that request was denied and he was obviously hung. Adolf Hitler. Once again, and for the last time, we are back in World War II. Likely one of the most notorious people to come out of the entire World War. The rise of Hitler is likely one of the most well-known and well-talked about of all of the people on this list. So for that reason, I'll keep it brief. Interestingly, unlike basically everybody we've talked about in this video, Hitler was not born in the country that he ended up ruling. Hitler was born in Austria, not Germany. Although being born and living very close to the German border, he felt a very strong sense of German patriotism. And also, interestingly, unlike almost everybody else in this list, Hitler wasn't instantly indoctrinated into politics as a young person. He actually spent his childhood and young adulthood in the arts, not in politics. As an 8-year-old child, he took singing lessons and attended a choir, and at that point, even considered becoming a priest. Just imagine if Hitler ended up becoming a priest. That's an insane thought. At the age of 18, Hitler was on his own and flat broke, unable to get into the School of Arts or Architecture because he did not have the secondary school credentials. And this is where we hear that, oh, if only he got accepted into art school. He was not accepted into a university for arts and architecture. And that's where things began to change. Because at the same time, in 1914, when he was rejected from school, the First World War broke out. Hitler enlisted. Even though he was an Austrian citizen, he was able to fight with German forces, likely by accident, and following an injury that took place in the war, he returned home from the war in 1917. I can only assume that the hard upbringing that Hitler had, combined with the war, Hitler described his role in World War I as the greatest of all experiences, and I can only assume that this is really the first time he felt a sense of purpose in his relatively tumultuous life so far. And I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that this, in the following years, would really spark what Hitler would end up becoming. After World War I was over, Hitler was looking for job opportunities and was actually appointed as an intelligence agent to influence and infiltrate the German Workers' Party. This was Hitler's official introduction into politics. And it only took from 1919 to 1933 for Hitler to rise through the ranks and go from a newly appointed intelligence agent to becoming the official dictator with a totalitarian regime within Germany. Throughout this totalitarian control from 1933 to 1945, Hitler committed more war crimes and human rights violations than you could possibly imagine, with the most notable of which being the Holocaust. But in 1945, his reign of terror and genocide was coming to a close, which brings us to late April 1945 in a bunker in Berlin. Hitler got word that Soviet troops were not only approaching Berlin quickly, but surrounding Berlin, and he had no other option than to go underground. While underground, he still tried to command what he could, although it was obvious that his people were no longer listening. And some of his most high-ranking officials behind his back were trying to negotiate a surrender, when all Hitler wanted was people to fight to the very death. He wanted no expense spared when it came to trying to get out of the situation, even though at this point he knew it was hopeless. Hitler had gotten word that the Soviets had entered Berlin and that there was absolutely no chance of him surviving. He decided, like the egomaniac that he was, that he wouldn't let anybody else take him out or even imprison him or anything of the sort. So while in the bunker with his brand new bride that he also married in the bunker, Hitler used a pew-pew to scratch his head. And I do apologize for the censorship, but I really have bills to pay. Following Hitler doing that, his wife, Eva Braun, took a pill that made her not feel so good, and the two were no longer around. But it doesn't end there, because following Hitler's instructions, Hitler didn't even want his dead body to be captured by the Soviets. So following his orders, some of Hitler's helpers collected his and Eva's bodies and burned them and then hid the ashes. Although the burned remains were eventually found by the Soviets, and dental records did confirm that these burnt remains belonged to Hitler. And it was then where the hellish, nightmarish Nazi regime was officially concluded. How the most notorious serial killers were caught. The year is 1888, and you are located in Whitechapel, England, one of the roughest areas in London's East End. You, like most of the people in your life and in Whitechapel, don't live a life of luxury at all. You struggle to make ends meet, and tonight don't even have the 2 pence to pay for a place to sleep. You used to have a more or less picturesque life until your husband died, and since being on your own, like many women at the time, you resorted to selling your body. Whitechapel wasn't a booming metropolitan area, but it did contain over 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes at the time. So to you, it was a better option than starving. With nowhere else to go, you spent the last few hours at the pub you frequented, and as the pub began to close, the bartender sensed that you weren't able to pay your bill. Unfortunately, they told you tonight it was on the house, as they knew you had fallen onto some tough times. You stumble out of this bar, beyond drunk, into the dark labyrinth that is the Whitechapel streets, and you begin to take the long and ominous walk home. At this time, it had to be at least 2 or 3 in the morning. The street was so dimly lit and the fog was so thick, you could barely see a person standing a few feet in front of you. Luckily, the labyrinth of small roads was something you were more than familiar with and could do with your eyes closed. And while there was nobody on this street beside yourself, you do notice a figure in the distance. Something that you knew wasn't typically there. It wasn't a lamppost, and it wasn't an animal. As you get closer, you realize that it's a man in a dark trench coat and tall hat. As your drunken thoughts begin to process what you're looking at, you realize that this man was your golden ticket. You had just possibly found a place to stay tonight and even a way to make a few dollars. And as you approach this man, you try to put yourself together and approach him confidently. You walk right up to him and tell him that if he's looking for a good time, you can both go back to his place, and before you could even finish your offer, you slowly notice this man developing an unnatural smirk. And before you're even fully able to process this unnerving smile, you notice something. The reflection of what streetlight was available twinkled off of an object that this man just pulled out of his pocket, although it wasn't a pocket watch or change. This man had just pulled out a 7-inch knife. You instantly realize you need to run away as soon as possible, but your alcohol-induced delayed reaction time prevented you from taking any action, and the only thing you could do was let out a gasp before this man raises the knife and cuts your existence short. Only a few hours later, at the very crack of dawn, a man is slowly venturing down a cobblestone road when he sees something on the sidewalk. He notices a woman on the sidewalk. Although this wasn't the typical Whitechapel homeless person. This was a woman face down, surrounded by blood. This man instantly gets out of his buggy, flips this woman over, only to realize that this woman was not only injured, but brutally murdered. Her neck was stabbed multiple times, and her torso was not only stabbed, but mutilated, with her intestines almost spilling out of her torso. This grim and disgusting discovery was one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper, and the start of a hunt for truth that would last over 137 years. There's no doubt that Jack the Ripper is one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious serial killer of all time. And of course, we're going to discuss exactly how he was caught. But before we discuss how he was caught, it's important to understand exactly how he wasn't caught so long ago. Obviously, technology wasn't nearly advanced as it was now, but that doesn't mean that crimes weren't solved. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, there was plenty of situations where Jack was very close to being caught and truthfully should have been caught, but we'll get to that. One of the biggest factors that consistently contributed to Jack the Ripper being able to go on for so long without being identified was the location of where he lived. As I mentioned earlier, Whitechapel was a rough area, and although it was tight and crowded, people weren't necessarily paying attention to others as they had enough to focus on. And weird things going on weren't so weird there. People shouting in the streets, people sleeping in the streets, people fighting, people with blood on their clothes, all weren't necessarily uncommon in a place where people were struggling to survive, dealing with disease, violence, and crime, and truthfully just trying to make it to their next meal, let alone their own next day. This gave Jack a lot of leeway to commit some truly horrendous crimes as long as he wasn't directly in anybody's eyesight. Another major contributing factor to the reason why he wasn't caught at the time is because he was only active for a few years. Obviously, being an active serial killer for any period of time is unacceptable. However, if you've seen any of our videos on serial killers, you would know that some killers are active for decades. At the time, it wasn't known how long Jack the Ripper was active, as his identity was unknown. Although, with the information that we have now, we can pinpoint exactly when he stopped killing and why he did too. But before we discuss that, let's first discuss how Jack the Ripper even earned a name as a serial killer. This brings us back to our initial story. A woman being found dead in the Whitechapel streets wasn't common, but wasn't unheard of. But what was unheard of was the sheer level of mutilation that occurred on her body. If this happened only once, there would be no Jack the Ripper. But the volume and consistency of these attacks in such a short amount of time were what fueled the media to create a monster, and one of the first ever famous serial killers. In 1888 alone, there is 5 confirmed killings associated with Jack the Ripper. These 5 victims are known as the canonical 5. And the reason these 5 victims are confirmed to be victims of Jack the Ripper are because they all exhibit trademarks of Jack's method of murder. All of these 5 women were either underprivileged, vulnerable, or had recently fallen onto hard times. And most notably, all of these victims had been murdered and brutally mutilated in such a specific manner. But it wasn't mutilation alone that created Jack the Ripper's signature murder. It was how precise and consistent these mutilations were. Coroners and doctors who inspected these victims once they were found would all remark that whoever had done this must have been experienced with a knife in some way, whether they were a doctor or a butcher or a shoemaker. And during the time that these murders were being investigated in the late 1800s, people in those exact professions, among others, were questioned, as whoever was wielding this knife and mutilating these women was no amateur. And that is beyond unsettling. As these murders were first being discovered, people believed that there was multiple murderers on the loose, as people were being killed more than ever, and these murders were happening so close to each other. And for 2 of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, they were even murdered in the same night, 45 minutes apart from each other. And for that fact, it's reasonable to assume that it might have been multiple people. However, like I mentioned, the sheer consistency of these mutilations made it hard to believe there was more than one person. And with every murder, the newspaper was feeding more and more into the story that a monster was on the loose. Obviously, the newspapers covered these strange murders to keep locals up to date on what was happening, although some speculate that the newspaper was pushing the story for ulterior motives as well. The name Jack the Ripper didn't come from the police or from the public. It was a name that was referenced in a letter that was sent to the media from somebody claiming to be the murderer. That letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, at that time and until today was considered to be a hoax. However, Jack the Ripper must have gotten word about this hoax and decided to confirm things once and for all, as shortly after the Dear Boss letter was submitted to the media, another letter was submitted to the media, known as the From Hell letter. However, this letter was more convincing, as it wasn't just a written statement from somebody somebody claiming that they were the murderer. It was a letter that stated that it was from the murderer and proved it by including half of a kidney in the letter. This half kidney was from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it was at that point when the newspaper and the general public knew that they had one deranged individual on their hands. And it was also that letter that launched Jack the Ripper from local terror to nationwide and later global infamy. Up until last year, that's basically where the story would have ended. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity was never known, and he was somebody that truly terrorized not only his city, but the world. That was until recently. In 2007, a self-proclaimed Jack the Ripper expert named Russell Edwards bought a shawl. But it wasn't any shawl. He wasn't upgrading his wardrobe. He bought a shawl that was believed to have been owned by one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, but this shawl was also present at a murder scene and was likely to have DNA on it. And it was this purchase that led to one of the biggest cold cases being solved in almost 150 years. Edwards gave this shawl that he had purchased to a biochemist and tasked him with finding any DNA possible. And that's exactly what he did. And only a few years later, a peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis that the biochemist was able to find was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The article that this biochemist published claimed exactly what Russell Edwards had written about all the way back in 2014, that Jack the Ripper was a man named Aaron Kosminski. And while this article has been criticized by scientists for making misassumptions, it does make a pretty compelling case, and at the very least, provides a bit more context to the entire Jack the Ripper situation. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11th, 1865 in Poland, but emigrated to England in the 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel in the East End of London, and his occupation was a barber or hairdresser. That alone is interesting because that confirms that Aaron Kosminski was in the area of the Jack the Ripper killings when they happened, and he also was in a profession that wasn't a stranger to sharp objects. But the information gets deeper. In 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his own sister with a knife. Coincidentally, 1891 was the same year that the suspected Jack the Ripper killings stopped happening. Aaron Kosminski spent the rest of his life institutionalized, and while information about his time in these sanitariums is relatively undocumented, or at least deeply archived, it is documented that he did suffer with severe schizophrenia, leaving him very troubled. Which is also interesting because the things that Jack the Ripper did would, in my opinion, only be the result of somebody who was truly disturbed. But on top of all of these similarities and coincidences, the biggest claim of the article submitted by the biochemist that Russell Edwards had commissioned was that they claimed to have a DNA link between Aaron Kosminski and DNA found on the shawl of the Jack the Ripper victim. It was actually a 100% DNA match. And that piece of evidence alone was the nail in the coffin, and what sparked a lot of the news you likely saw this year of Jack the Ripper's identity finally being revealed. Over the years, there's been a handful of interesting theories about who Jack the Ripper truly was, but I think the argument that it was Aaron Kosminski is definitely the most compelling. But with that being said, was Jack the Ripper ever truly caught? Well, if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, then his identity was revealed, which means something. But also, if it was Aaron Kosminski, that does mean that he was institutionalized in 1891 for the rest of his life, meaning that he was imprisoned not for his crimes, but for his illness. His illness that likely sparked these crimes. So although you could argue Jack the Ripper was still not 1000% confirmed, I do think that there is a strong argument that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. And for that reason, I do believe he was caught. But even if you don't agree, I think this story is extremely interesting. It adds, if nothing else, new layers to one of the coldest cases in serial killer history. But this is only the first case of 3 that we're covering in this video, so let me summarize. How exactly did Jack the Ripper get caught? According to the evidence we have, he got caught because he was consistently killing, he killed in a very methodical way, he confirmed he was a man acting alone in a letter he wrote to the media, and that letter not only confirmed that he was one person, but also gave the media ammo to create this spectacle that was Jack the Ripper. And it was this spectacle that got him caught. Because if the media didn't make Jack the Ripper the big boogeyman that he was, there would not be Jack the Ripper historians in the modern day. And if there was no Jack the Ripper in the modern day, there would be no collector buying this old shawl that was at the scene of the crime, and there would be nobody to give it to a biochemist to check it for DNA. And it's interesting to think, if Jack the Ripper never had written that letter, would we be talking about him today? And would he have ever been caught? I guess we'll never know. But let's move on. Saturday, August 24th, 1985. You are a 13-year-old boy and you had just returned home to Southern California from a road trip with your family. The road trip was fun, but the entire time there was an eerie undertone, as your parents and the family you had been visiting out of town were all focused on one subject: the serial killer that had been on the loose in Southern California. You didn't know much of the situation, and truthfully, you weren't too interested, but you overheard your parents talking about some sort of night stalker. And between overhearing your parents and news coverage, it was hard not to have some sort of context about what was going on. And from what you understood, there was this crazy man on the loose who at this point had killed 13 innocent people, and was still not only not caught, but not even identified. This, to you, was scary. But what was about to happen on this fateful night was going to be a lot scarier. You return home from your family vacation later in the night, and you spent the evening unpacking, something that you delayed doing because you were watching your favorite VHS. It was a movie known as Back to the Future, and it only came out a month prior. And watching this movie kept you up later than usual. And this movie left you excited and unable to sleep, which is why you were up at midnight, which for you was later than usual. The rest of your family was sleeping, so you made sure to be quiet and keep to yourself. It was until you realized that you left your favorite pillow in the family RV, and you weren't going to bed without it, so you had to quietly sneak out to it to get it, obviously without waking your parents. You tiptoe outside, and once you make it into the yard, you hear something that sounds like footsteps, but you're not alarmed. You have a large backyard that's unfenced that backs onto a hill, and seeing possums, raccoons, and even deer weren't necessarily uncommon. And you were curious to see what was making all of this noise. You don't see any animal or anything at all, and figure whatever little critter it was must have scurried away. And since you're outside, you figured, why not go to the garage and work on your bike a little bit? Back to the Future got you inspired to tinker around, and maybe you were about to build the first time-traveling bike. And it was shortly into this tinkering session that you once again heard footsteps. But this time it was different. There was no suspicion of this being an animal. You were certain that you were hearing a person walking around the property. Your biggest fear was that your dad was coming out to see what you were up to, but what was actually outside was much more terrifying. It only took a few moments for you to realize that whoever was outside wasn't your dad, because they didn't enter the garage and they didn't say anything. You had an odd feeling and decided to hide behind the car and realized that you couldn't be here. You bolted out of the garage directly into the house, and as soon as you got into the house, you looked out the window to see exactly what was outside. And that's when you see a man walking around your home. You see this man start to walk away, and before he fully leaves your property, you want to get one last look to see if you know who this man could be and what he was doing there. And as you run from your bedroom out through the kitchen to the garage, your dad stops you in the kitchen and asks you, what are you doing? Why are you up at this hour? Hastily, you tell your dad that there's a man in the yard and you need to see who he is and what he's doing now. And after explaining this entire situation in only a matter of seconds, you shove your dad out of the way and run into the yard, when you catch a glimpse of a figure wearing a baseball cap, a jacket, and blue jeans. And although you can't identify this figure, you see them get into an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack. As this man got into his car, you run into the road to follow him. And although his car is facing the opposite direction to you, he doesn't just drive off. He does a U-turn in the middle of the road to go the opposite direction. And this gives you the opportunity to see this man's face. The man drove off, and you, confused, go back inside and explain everything to your dad. Concerned, your dad already had the police called, and rather swiftly, the police were at the door taking a written statement. But it was only an hour later when the police called back to get even more information. And then a few hours later, at 6 in the morning, the police once again returned for more information. And the reason why the police returned at 6 in the morning was because only a mile and a half away from your home, there was another mysterious murder. And it happened only shortly after your initial report was made. And it was at that point when everything had clicked. Initially, you and your parents assumed that there must have been some sort of potential burglar lurking in the yard that was scared away when he saw that people were up. But once the police had confirmed that there was a murder only a mile from your home, they suspected that you didn't find a burglar, but that you likely came face to face with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1985, the police identified a vehicle that matched the description that you had given them. It was an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack parked on the side of the road. The police had this car towed and impounded, likely to provoke the owner to show up to reclaim it and then to be investigated. When the police towed this car, they asked you, is this the car that you saw that night? And you confirmed it. And the reason why they towed this car initially is because on the night when they took their official statement, you told them that you saw this exact car. And you even remembered the first few digits of the license plate. This alone was a huge breakthrough in the case, and was one of the major turning points that got Richard Ramirez caught. Once the vehicle was confirmed to be the one that they saw that night, police investigated the entire vehicle, finding very little evidence. That was until they found a single fingerprint on the driver's side mirror, a fingerprint that linked the driver of the vehicle to Richard Ramirez. And at that point, a photo and name was submitted to the public as a person of interest. And it was at that point when the floodgates on this case burst open. One day after the name and photo were submitted to the public, on August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez was trying to steal a vehicle. And while attempting to steal this vehicle, an altercation broke out. And this altercation got the attention of neighbors. And although Ramirez was able to get car keys from a woman that he had just assaulted, before he could drive away with his vehicle he had attempted to steal, a neighbor had pulled Ramirez out of the vehicle, and other neighbors at this point had also approached the vehicle and began to beat and restrain Ramirez. The police were called, showed up, and arrested the man. And 1 week later, the police called you one final time to identify the person you saw that night in a lineup. You looked at 5 criminals standing beside each other, and you instantly recognized the man who you saw in your backyard. You tell the police that that was the man you saw that night, and it was your testimony that led to the Night Stalker being caught once and for all. The boy in the story that identified Ramirez is known as James Ramiro, and he is truly one brave young man. Not even a young man, he's like 13, he's literally a boy, like a child. And perhaps him being so naive allowed him to have the confidence and the blissful ignorance to follow a mysterious man into your backyard in the middle of the night. As a grown man, I wouldn't do that alone, even if I was armed. Regardless, James being up late that night and deciding to follow this man to the yard ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and undoubtedly saved the lives of innocent people that Richard Ramirez would have victimized next. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. His convictions specifically were 12 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of second-degree murder, and 14 counts of first-degree burglary. And although he was on death row, he died on June 7th, 2013 at the age of 53 of lymphoma. I think the story kind of tells itself here. James was an absolute legend of a boy, and Ramirez was a troubled excuse for a man. And although Ramirez was unfortunately able to victimize so many innocent people, justice was at least eventually served, largely in part to James. So exactly how did the Night Stalker get caught? Well, he messed with the wrong boy staying up past his bedtime. The year is 1998. You live in a small town in England known as Hyde, and you have recently been going through some distressing times with your family. Your father-in-law has been experiencing very odd medical symptoms, and it's believed that he may have cancer. Obviously, wanting the best, you and your family decide to go to one of the most respected and well-known doctors in the entire city of Hyde, a man named Harold Shipman. Your father-in-law gets an examination, and a few days later, you call him to follow up on the prognosis. The doctor on the phone rather firmly responds, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs," which was a harsh way of delivering news that someone was going to die soon. Almost eerie, as Easter was only 2 weeks away. Due to the shock of the news you've just received, you appreciate him telling you the truth, and you hang up the phone and begin talking to your family. Your family took this news a little bit softer, as they believed that he was being metaphorical and almost joking, saying that the end was soon, but there was no way that it could have been this soon, right? Regardless, your family started to make the appropriate plans. And almost on cue, only 4 days later after that phone call, even earlier than the doctor had claimed, your father-in-law had passed away. The truth behind his death was a lot more disturbing than simply him succumbing to the disease he had. You meet with the doctor after your father-in-law's passing to discuss if anything could have been done and what really happened and why this was so sudden. And the doctor, rather sternly yet calmly and somewhat compassionately, described to you that sometimes things happen so fast, and realistically in situations with terminal illness, there's not much you can do. This doctor tells you that an autopsy isn't required and that you should plan the funeral as soon as possible to begin the grieving process. And like many others before you, you take his advice and opt to not have an autopsy. This practice was common for Harold Shipman, as he not only advocated for all of his patients who had family members who passed away to not only not get an autopsy, but also to get a cremation as fast as possible. But as you likely already know, these recommendations weren't coming from a place of compassion, but instead out of a place of self-preservation. And the reason why I say this is because Harold Shipman was actively killing his patients. He targeted typically elderly women and sometimes elderly men too, and for the most part victimized people who were already terminally ill and unlikely to be suspected of accidental or intentional death. Harold was a troubled individual, there was no doubt about it. His mother passed away at a young age, and he struggled with drug abuse in his early career as a doctor and was even admitted to a facility. However, it wasn't put on his record and he was only given a warning. This allowed him to continue practicing and even to get his own private practice, which may sound like a fortunate second chance, although that optimism slips away when you realize what happened within his private practice. Harold was no longer addicted to heroin, but he was seemingly addicted to giving his target patients a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug that was given to to his mother when she was dying. Harold Shipman was suspected of killing his victims as early as 1975, and it wasn't until 1998 when suspicions of foul play began to become overwhelming. As in small communities, word spreads quickly, and it was at that point when Harold Shipman was investigated. Upon investigation, it was confirmed that Harold Shipman's mortality rate as a doctor was 10 times above the average. Yet, when the health authority investigated all of the paperwork associated with these patients and their deaths, they found no irregularities, which at the time lowered suspicion. But as we know now, these papers were actually forged to fit the stories that he was spinning. And while the health authority was investigating the patients, the Greater Manchester Police were investigating Shipman, and unfortunately also failed, as they weren't even able to find his criminal history or the time he spent in an institution for his drug abuse. What this essentially means is that this first investigation into Harold Shipman almost cleared his name. It didn't clear suspicions, but legally speaking, Harold was doing nothing wrong. He was a standard doctor who unfortunately had some unlucky clients. But this story didn't last for long. Only a few months later, on June 24th, 1998, Harold made a very distinct choice that led directly to him being caught. Harold Shipman was at the home of one of his patients, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. This woman was 81 years old and described as being in great health. She had an appointment with Shipman at her home to have a routine blood test, although what she got instead was a lethal dose of diamorphine. As per his standard practice, he quickly wrote her death certificate and stated her cause of death as old age and suggested she be cremated immediately. But that wasn't the only document he forged. Somewhat unusually, he also forged a will, and it was Kathleen's will, giving all of her worldly possessions to her doctor, Harold Shipman. And it was this move specifically that raised more than a few red flags. Kathleen was a former mayor of Hyde, and for that reason was a notable person in the community, and her death was very upsetting to many, particularly her family, who were shocked not only that their healthy mother and grandmother passed away, but also that she'd left all of her money to her doctor. And with that, they began investigating Harold themselves, when they quickly realized that he was behind not only the forgery, but also the death. The family was able to confirm that Harold's fingerprints were on the will that he forged, and that the will was even typed on his typewriter that was missing a key, which undoubtedly confirmed that he was the one who wrote it. And this family somehow was able to find out about Harold's past when the police weren't able to, which at the very least is odd and borderline negligent by the police. Kathleen's family demanded that her body be autopsied, and it was during that autopsy when it was found that she had a lethal dose of diamorphine in her muscle tissue, and Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Once he was arrested, the family of 11 other victims who had their family member buried and not cremated opted to have their family members' bodies examined by the police. And these examinations also showed that these 11 other patients of Harold Shipman were also victims of his. And it was at this time that Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders from 1995 to 1998. Although in the investigations that followed his initial conviction, there was over 284 confirmed killings by Harold Shipman. And there are even more that are unconfirmed but likely possible. Just let that sink in. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but he was confirmed to have killed at least 284 of his patients, likely from the years of 1975 to 1998. Harold received life in prison, although only a few years into his sentence, he ended his own life on January 13th, 2004 at the age of 57. Shipman never gave any motive for his murders and never admitted to any of it. These are just 3 cases of how some of the most infamous serial killers were caught. And if you are interested in hearing more, unfortunately, there is more stories to tell. The craziest prison escapes from around the world. The year is 2030, and you and the love of your life are looking out of the window of a luxury helicopter at the beautiful landscape of southern France. Doesn't that just sound like the best vacation ever and a dream come true? Now imagine this. Swap luxury helicopter for old hijacked helicopter, swap the love of your life for one of your co-conspirators, and swap helicopter tour with prison escape. And while you're still in the south of France, you're in a much different situation. And this situation is one of the craziest French prison escapes ever. Our story begins on July 7th, 1963, when our protagonist Pascal Payet was born. And while Pascal had a relatively normal childhood in the south of France, it wasn't long before he started his criminal career and lived a life that was anything but normal. In 1988, at the ripe age of 25, Pascal was convicted of his first crime, aggravated assault. And only 5 years later, in 1993, he was once again convicted of conspiracy. But it wasn't until 4 years after that, on November 20th, 1997, when Pascal's story truly began. Pascal and a group of other French criminals planned and executed an attack on an armored vehicle for the Bank of France. The robbery of this armored vehicle was anything but smooth, and during the robbery, one of the guards of this vehicle was killed, turning a robbery case into a murder case and beyond. Pascal and his associates were able to leave the scene of the crime successfully that day, but they weren't free for long, because in 1999, Pascal, along with his associate Eric Alborio, were found and arrested in Paris. I want to emphasize, all of this is horrible, and he definitely deserves to be in jail, but it's crazy that already this guy is literally living like it's GTA France. But if you think the actions that got Pascal into jail were GTA-esque, just wait until I tell you how he got out of jail. It is January 1999, and Pascal has just arrived in Lithuania. He sees a structure begin to appear outside of the prison bus window. This is a maximum security French prison, and it has existed for over 2 centuries, seeing over the years the craziest list of almost any criminal you could imagine. The history of this place alone is insane, and with centuries to refine their techniques, they were no amateurs when it came to holding and punishing criminals. This prison was built and rebuilt numerous times throughout the last 2 centuries, and its most recent iteration was regarded as one of the most technologically advanced prisons in all of France, and it was considered escape-proof. And if you watched our first video about prison escapes, then you know that escape-proof prisons are not a title, they're a challenge. And to Pascal, that challenge seemed enticing. As Pascal is walked into his cell and sat on his bed, the guards uncuff his ankles and wrists, slam the door behind them, and Pascal is now officially in his new, all-expenses-paid home in the south of France. And the timer has officially begun. To the French government, the timer is counting down the amount of days that Pascal has left to serve. However, in Pascal's brain, a different timer has begun. The timer to plan an escape. And while Pascal had 30 years to sit and think about his plan, it only took him 2 years to theorize and execute his grand escape. Or escapes, I should say. It is October 12th, 2001, and it has been 2 years since Pascal has been behind bars. And over this time, he has been coordinating strategically with one man on the outside, a man named Frederic Impoko. And together, they put together a plan to quickly and easily take Pascal out of this prison. And today was the day they executed the plan. The plan began with Impoko hijacking a helicopter and flying it over top of the prison. The helicopter then quickly landed in a designated part of the courtyard where Pascal would enter the helicopter and the two would fly away into freedom. Although the plan didn't go that smoothly, because although they both got away successfully out of the jail, only 6 days later, Impoko was detained and taken in for questioning. But while Impoko was now behind bars, Pascal was a free man once again. But unfortunately, he still needed to make a living now that he was on the outside. And he dove right back into the only career he knew, stealing. And for 2 years, while on the run, Pascal would rob small-time jewelry stores and live off the profits from his heists. But after those 2 years, he must have began to get lonely, or maybe he felt bad for leaving his associates behind. Because on April 14th, 2003, Pascal decided that being free alone wasn't good enough, and he wanted to free some of his friends as well. And that is exactly what he did. Pascal once again organized a helicopter escape from the exact same prison that he escaped from 2 years earlier. This time, he was already free, and he was now freeing 3 other men. The same men that were involved in the bank truck heist in 1997. And once again, a helicopter was hijacked, flown over top of the prison, quickly landing to pick up the criminals, and then flying off into the sunset. But once again, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because this time it wasn't just one of the men that were caught. 3 weeks after this second helicopter prison escape, all of the men were caught. There's absolutely no question that Pascal is a bad man, but he's definitely a good friend to his fellow criminals, proving that maybe there is honor among thieves after all. Interestingly, while imprisoned, once again, Pascal decided to take another approach, and instead of planning another escape, he decided to write a blog post. A blog post specifically about the mistreatment he was experiencing in the French prison system. He complained that the conditions he were experiencing was poor, and he was also complaining of being transferred so many times, specifically being transferred 9 times in 30 months. And in combination with this letter, he also went on a hunger strike in one of these prisons because he didn't want to be moved again. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they, happened. At this point, Pascal is behind bars for good, right? He was able to coordinate 2 separate helicopter escapes, and at this point, he is now serving so much time behind bars. Like, seriously, after all of the dust had settled, Pascal was facing 30 years for the murder that happened on the truck in 1997, 6 years for the jailbreak that happened in 2001, 7 years for busting his friends out in 2003, and now he's resorted to writing blog posts and not eating. So now he's not only mentally given up, but also physically frail. There's no way that he's, going to have any other escapes, right? And the answer is, of course not. By the time that July 2007 rolled around, Pascal was one of the most closely monitored prisoners in all of France, and for good reason. And what that looked like was consistent surveillance by guards and also being placed permanently in solitary confinement. In combination with both of those measures, Pascal was also moved every 6 months to new prisons so that he couldn't formulate a plan for too long, which also ironically increased his transfer frequency, something he was trying to get reduced with his hunger strike and letter. Regardless, Regardless, even with all of these measures in place, Pascal still had a bit more fight in him. And on July 14th, 2007, on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France, Pascal made his final escape. If you're unfamiliar with Bastille Day, imagine the 4th of July, but in France. Fireworks, food, friends, family, just a lot of festive things. And while many see this as an opportunity to relax, Pascal saw this as an opportunity to get to work. And work he did. Because while all of the festivities were happening outside and law enforcement were already busy enough with all of the festivities happening, 4 men in ski masks were quickly approaching a French airport to once again hijack a helicopter. These men were successful. They kidnapped a pilot, hijacked the helicopter, and forced this pilot to fly over the prison that Pascal was currently in. The helicopter once again landed in the prison. The men went into the prison and freed Pascal from his solitary confinement, and in only 5 minutes after arriving, the helicopter was flying out of the jail. The criminals forced the pilot to fly 40 kilometers northeast to a location on the Mediterranean coast, where they had the pilot land the helicopter, and the pilot and the helicopter were free. And unfortunately, so was Pascal Payet. 2 days after this escape took place, a Europe-wide arrest warrant was placed against Pascal Payet, and even still, it took over 2 months for Pascal to be caught. However, on September 21st, 2007, in a suburb of Barcelona, Spain, Pascal was caught and once again put into French custody, where he remains to this very day. This story is almost picture perfect and kinda has everything you want. A beautiful European landscape, helicopters, crime, suspense, helicopters, friendship. It's really got it all, and I knew for that reason I had to make it the first entry on this list. Because seriously, how do you have 3 consecutive prison escapes all involving hijacked helicopters? Like, if nothing else, you've got to admit that this guy is consistent. Pascal found his method and just worked it till he couldn't anymore. What I find crazy is now, after the 3rd successful helicopter escape, the police have decided that they're going to make the location of Pascal private for security reasons, obviously to avoid a 4th helicopter escape, which I think is logical and possibly a bit, late, but I guess still worth doing. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that there's a good chance that Pascal could have been a free man after his first successful helicopter escape. At the time, he was behind bars and facing 30 years for a murder that took place in 1997, but decided that even though he was free, he wanted to go back and help his 3 friends escape as well, which is something I really wish I knew the motivation behind, but I guess that is kind of up to speculation. He could have freed his friends because, he wanted his friends to have the same freedom as him, or maybe because he was, as a free man still living a life of crime, he wanted his crime friends back so he could, have more people to commit crime with. It's really up in the air on his motivation, but regardless, he did it. And now, as of today, his laundry list of charges goes as follows: 30 years for the murder, 6 years for jailbreak 1, 7 years for jailbreak 2, 5 years for jailbreak 3, and on top of all of these, an additional 15 years for all of the robberies that took place while he was a free man. At that point, he would have been better off just serving his initial 30 years. But I guess the moral of the story here is crime never pays. Now, what do you get when you mix 2 charming, intelligent, cold-blooded killers, a lonely and vulnerable prison employee, and paper-thin prison walls? Well, you'd be getting our next story. Richard Ricky Matt was born on June 25th, 1966, and grew up in foster care in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was anything but desirable. Throughout the course of his adult life, he had served multiple prison sentences that were shorter term. But once he was free again after serving his time, he decided that his best course of action was to get a job and then 2 weeks after working there, rob, kidnap, and murder his boss. And after this murder, he fled to Mexico, where he, a year later, robbed and killed another man. For this second murder, he received a 23-year sentence. But in 2007, Richard was extradited back to the United States, where he received a 25 to life sentence for his first murder, the murder of William Rickerson, the man who tried to give this convict a career and an opportunity, only to be robbed, kidnapped, and murdered and dismembered by the man he was only trying to help. Regardless, Richard was convicted of second-degree murder and was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14th, 1980, in Binghamton, New York State. He was raised by a single mother and grew up with 2 sisters, and from a child, he was a troubled individual. Even as young as 9, David was demonstrating extremely violent tendencies, and for that reason, his mom sent him to Florida to live with his uncle, which resulted in David stealing and wrecking his aunt's car, and his aunt and uncle then sending him into foster care. During his late teens, Sweat was essentially homeless, living off of any money he could make selling weed. It was during this time that he began planning elaborate burglaries. And throughout his late teens in the 1990s, Sweat was arrested and sent to prison multiple times, where he served his sentences. But on the 4th of July in 2002, Sweat, his cousin, and a third accomplice decided that they would cash in on the profits of 4th of July and robbed a fireworks store in Pennsylvania. Not to steal fireworks, however, but to steal guns. These three men were successfully able to steal the firearms. And that night, after the robbery, drove from Pennsylvania back to New York State, where they planned on splitting up the loot. The three men pulled into a dimly lit parking lot where the others' cars were parked, and they began to divide up the loot. But while transferring guns from one of the cars to the other, a police officer spotted what was going on and decided to investigate. As the police officer began to approach the man, Sweat opened fire on the police officer, but didn't kill him. That was until Sweat decided to run over this police officer with his vehicle and then drive away. After Sweat was gone, Sweat's cousin decided to then shoot the police officer in the head again. The men all left the parking lot, but fortunately, only a few days later, all three men were caught. Sweat pled guilty to avoid the death sentence and was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was too sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility. I'm sure you're already seeing a bit of similarities and differences between these two horrible people. Richard and David both spent time in foster care, both had violent tendencies, and both had numerous run-ins in the law and spent time in prison before the time they ever even met, which leads us to when they did meet, which obviously took place within the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. And unfortunately, these two didn't only serve time together, but formed a rather twisted friendship, and shortly after bonding, began planning their escape from prison. At the beginning of this story, I did mention that these men were intelligent and charming, and unfortunately, that is the case for most psychopaths, something that obviously both of these men were. They had no empathy, no remorse, and no issue killing innocent people for their own gain. But another key component of psychopaths are their tendency to manipulate people, and that tendency to manipulate was a huge factor in the eventual escape of Richard and David. And that escape in question is kind of a blend of the very real Alcatraz escape that I actually talked about in the first prison escape video and the fictional Shawshank Redemption prison escape. Early on in their plans to escape, they both knew that if they wanted to escape, they were going to need some serious help. And because of this, the first step in their plan involved manipulating somebody on the inside to begin helping them. And that person on the inside was Joyce Mitchell. Mitchell was an older woman working as a supervisor in the Taylor department of the prison. And for reasons unknown to us, Richard and David decided that she was the perfect person to convert to their side. And how they went about doing this was extremely upsetting because they used not aggression or fear, but love. Both of these men individually began to develop intimate relationships with Joyce Mitchell within the prison. And over time, were able to get her to begin helping them by providing supplies, specifically by getting tools out of the prison workshop, hiding them in burger meat, and delivering them to these two criminals. Now, I don't want to make Joyce Mitchell kind of sound like the innocent victim in this story because it did come out that there was a plan that David and Richard would kill Joyce's husband. But yeah, don't think of her as some victim. She was complicit in this. But just imagine the sheer riz of these two men. Like, Mitchell has a husband, a job, and somehow she was able to be manipulated and convinced by two criminals that the best course of action of her was to aid these criminals in their escape. And once these criminals escape, they can kill her husband and then all go to Mexico together. Like, that is crazy level manipulation. Once Richard and David had Mitchell on their side, their plan was in full effect. And from that point, it only took 6 months for that plan to be executed. Over these 6 months, Mitchell would slowly bring different tools and components into the jail cells of each of these men, and possibly do other things as well. Regardless, once these men had the tools, they were able to begin chipping away at their very own cell walls. Similar to the Alcatraz escapes, both of these men developed holes in their cells under the sink where they could slip into the endless labyrinth of tunnels existing within the prison. The men were quickly able to access the tunnel system behind the walls. However, it took most of that 6 months to develop a plan on exactly where to go in the tunnel system and also to cut holes into huge steam pipes that they would eventually climb through for their escape. There's actually an investigation video showing two investigators going from the prison cell to the manhole cover, showing exactly how long and tight and uncomfortable this entire journey is. And it took the investigators only 20 minutes to get through all of it. This includes going down 6 stories via catwalks and pipes, and then traveling across the pipeline, going through small holes in the wall between blocks until they eventually get to a huge steam pipe that they likely took months to cut a hole into. And how they would do this is literally every night making this entire journey to make slight holes in the pipe until they could finally cut the whole chunk of metal out of the pipe. And then eventually, once they could go into this pipe, they were able to climb through it, enter the final room that led them to essentially a sewer under the road, roughly 150 meters outside of the prison, where they could climb a ladder, raise the manhole cover, and be free. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Mitchell, up until this point, only brought the men tools, she also was supposed to be the getaway driver. But on the night of the escape, Mitchell had a panic attack, thought she was having a heart attack, and went to the hospital. So a different different prison employee actually ended up being their getaway driver. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. On June 5th, 2015, at 10:30 p.m., both Matt and David were accounted for in the nightly head count at the prison. However, the next morning on June 5th at 5:50 a.m., during morning count, they were unaccounted for, and the search began. It only took a few hours for the prison to notice the external breach. They had only 150 meters outside of the prison wall. It was the obviously open manhole cover that had led directly to the basement of the prison. Due to this discovery, it didn't take long for investigators to find out exactly how Richard and David escaped. Interestingly, when the investigators were looking through the tunnel system that they used to escape, they found an interesting note. It was simply a piece of paper that said, "Have a nice day," and drawn below that was a racist Asian smiley face with a triangular rice hat, which is just odd. But now the men were free, but their plans were still not completed. The original plan was to murder Mitchell's husband and then flee to Mexico. But with Mitchell in the hospital and them having a completely different getaway driver, they decided their best bet was to go to Canada. But they couldn't just go straight there, and they had to take their time. And during that time, roughly 3 weeks, there was an extensive manhunt that was established by both the American and Canadian governments to make sure that these two men did not escape. 20 days after the initial escape, one of the two men was spotted for the first time. Richard Matt was spotted in Franklin County, New York. He was spotted because he was shooting at traffic with a 20-gauge shotgun taken from a hunting camp. Obviously, when you shoot at pedestrians, the police are going to get involved. And shortly after, Matt was shooting at civilians. The police shot and killed Richard. But that's only Richard. At the time of Richard's death, David's location was still unknown, and the investigation was still well underway. And I can only assume for law enforcement that finding David was a lot more personal, as David was somebody who did kill a police officer. However, only 2 days after Richard was shot by police officers, David was spotted just jogging on the side of the road. The police officer that spotted him went to question him, where David began to run through a field and into a wooded area. The police officer quickly drew his pistol and shot David. However, David did not die. Interestingly, both of these two men were found only 2 kilometers from the Canadian-US border, meaning that if they weren't found when they did, they would have likely made it into Canada and possibly escaped conviction or death altogether. Or at the very least, they would have extended their freedom by quite a bit. After everything was said and done, Richard Matt was killed. Sweat pled guilty to an additional 2 counts of felony, first-degree escape, and an additional count of promoting prison contraband, which gave him an additional 7 years, which was served consecutively with his previous life sentence. Joyce Mitchell pled guilty and received 7 years in prison and a $6,300 fine, as well as $80,000 in restitution. And as of February 2020, she was actually released and is now on parole. And Gene Palmer, the backup driver and the other prison official who aided in the escape of these 2 killers, was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,300. So yeah, if you haven't learned anything in this video so far, I think one important takeaway is that if you ever do plan on escaping prison, 2 good ways of going about it are having a helicopter or just extreme riz. And at this point, I can't even imagine the possibilities of a man with extreme riz and a helicopter. Jokes aside, let's just move on to the next and final entry on this list. And I say this list because if you guys like this concept, feel free to leave a like or a comment below letting me know you like prison escape videos. I'd be more than happy to make more of them in the future. Your support always means a lot. Let's move on. Alfred George Hines was born in 1917, and at the young age of only 7 years old, his father died when he was caught for an armed robbery and was served corporal punishment that actually ended up killing him. He was sentenced to 10 lashes from the Cat 06, which is just a crazy whip, and this entire process killed him. And because of this, Hines decided to run away from home at the age of 7. Hines briefly stayed at an orphanage before he escaped and began living on his own and surviving off of petty theft, which later landed him in a juvenile detention center, which he, at that point, once again, escaped from. Hines' upbringing was troubled to say the least, and when he turned 21, he was drafted into the Second World War. Something he didn't actually do, because he deserted the armed forces and went back to his full-time career of crime, which resulted in a jewelry heist that happened in 1953. This heist performed by Hines was in the multiple 6-figure range, and $90,000 of that was never found, ever. But shortly after this jewel heist, Hines was caught and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But like everybody else we've discussed on this list so far, Hines had no plans of staying in jail for his entire sentence. Only a few weeks into his stay in prison, Hines realized that at night, the guards were severely outnumbered, and there was really only 2 night guards per 1,000 inmates, which meant that Hines had a lot of time to work on his craft, and his craft in this case was metalworking. And what he was able to do was fashion a scrap piece of metal into a makeshift key to release himself from his cell without ever being detected. But picking the lock in his cell wasn't the only challenge he faced on this escape, because after he was out of his cell and out of the prison itself, he still had to climb a 20-foot wall. A feat so impressive that the media instantly gave him the name Houdini Hines because of his escape. Just keep in mind, for the guards, they were doing their nightly routine when they were walking by and they saw Hines, and then maybe an hour or 2 hours later when they would walk by again, Hines' cell was empty. There was no signs of any damage, and there was absolutely nothing changed besides the fact that Hines wasn't there. If they didn't know any better, Hines could have just disappeared into thin air. Although, that obviously wasn't the case. And after his escape, Hines spent 248 days as a free man working odd jobs until he was arrested again in 1956. And it was at this point when he was sent back to prison. But Hines knew that because he was going back to prison, he was going to be made an example of, because his initial escape made national headlines. And this obviously embarrassed the prison system and the government. So now that they had him back in their claws, they weren't going to let him go. And because of this, Hines had to think fast. And what Hines decided to do was, as he was being sent to prison for the second time, he decided to sue the prison system for misconduct. And even as a criminal, he had the right to a trial. And it was at this trial where he was able to execute his second escape. While in the courtroom, he asked the judge if he could use the washroom for just a moment. The judge agreed, and 2 guards brought Hines directly to the washroom, where they unshackled his hands and feet and allowed him to use the facility. But as soon as Hines was unshackled, he pushed both of the guards into the bathroom and locked it with a padlock that was left in the hallway by a co-conspirator. And the only reason he was able to even lock this door at all was because the day before the trial, a co-conspirator of Hines installed screw eyes on the stall door so that he could actually apply the padlock and lock these 2 in the washroom. After Hines' hands and feet were free and the guards were locked in the bathroom, he instantly made a run for it, and for the next 5 hours escaped directly to the airport where he was waiting for the next flight out of England. But before he could catch any flight, he was caught and brought back to prison for a 3rd time. Within a year of being brought back to prison for the 3rd time, he made his 3rd and final escape. The escape itself was nothing to write home about, although it did go to show the sheer perseverance and dedication that Hines had to not being in prison. But after being caught for a final time and brought back to jail, he decided that escaping wasn't the way to go. And from that point on, he decided to consistently get into legal disputes with the prison system to try to prove his innocence or to get his jail time appealed. He was basically spending all of his time in jail using the legal system against itself to try to get out of jail ASAP. And while he wasn't successful at it, and he did serve the rest of his time in prison, he was able to win a few £1,000s from random settlements that he was pursuing. Hines also falls into the category of orphan/foster care child turned prison escapee, which is interesting. That's definitely not something I intended to do in this video, but it is an interesting consistency I've noticed throughout most of these prison escapes. And I think the fact that Hines was able to escape prison 3 times definitely earned him the nickname Houdini Hines. But once again, we find ourselves in a situation where Hines would have been better off just serving the initial 12 years than escaping and then serving the rest of his time. Sure, he had more breaks in between, but living as an active fugitive is definitely not a life that I would want to live. I couldn't imagine having to look over your shoulder every day just to try to live a normal life. But I know I said that this was the last story in the video, but I actually have a quick bonus one, so let's get into it. Yoga is really relaxing and has a lot of health benefits. But one of the benefits that most people don't talk about when they speak of yoga is escaping prison. But for Korean thief Choi Gap-bok, being an expert in yoga for over 23 years was the deciding factor between being in jail and being a free man. Let me explain. On September 12th, 2012, Choi Gap-bok was arrested in association with a mysterious theft. It was assumed that he was the leader of a theft ring, and for that reason, the police wanted to hold him until they could gather more evidence on him in the entire situation. And on that day, Choi was placed in a cell. And while his stay was at that point undetermined, Choi was personally determined to make that stay as short as possible. And how he did so was extremely interesting, because during Choi's time in this jail cell, he realized that at the bottom of the jail cell door, there was a hole. And this hole was useful for him because every day this is how the guards would feed him. But he quickly began to ponder if this was a hole he could fit through. The hole was only 15 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Not large at all, but Choi wasn't really a large man either. Choi was only 5'4" and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Even still, this hole was put in these doors for food, not people. One night, after being fed dinner, Choi asked one of the guards if he could have some skin ointment. He felt a rash coming on and he wanted to subdue it early. And luckily, the guards obliged. They handed him a skin ointment and then went back to their post. And late into that night, Choi waited until the 3 guards that were monitoring his cell fell asleep, which is when Choi began to execute his master plan. Choi applied this skin ointment all across his body to essentially lube up and slide through the crack on the bottom of the door. After applying the ointment to his skin, specifically his upper body and head, he was able to escape his cell in only 34 seconds. And after escaping his cell, he was easily able to sneak out of the jail and be a free man. Hours after Choi had snuck out of the jail and was running as far away as he could from the jail itself, the officers woke up and they looked in his cell, and when they tried to wake up Choi, they realized that Choi was in his bed. There was a decoy in the place he should have been, but there was no evidence of an escape until they checked the CCTV footage and realized exactly how he escaped. Interestingly, Choi, who was in a cell for 5 days, had the wherewithal to put a decoy in his bed when the previous two criminals we just talked about were planning for 6 months and still couldn't drum up a decoy in any of that time. Just an interesting observation. But what else is interesting is that even though Choi was able to make nearly an impossible escape and use his flexibility and lubrication skills to escape a jail cell, he was not able to remain free for long, because 6 days after his escape, he was recaptured and put into a cell with a much smaller food slot. This one was a lot shorter, but I kind of wanted to add it as a bonus because I just thought it was funny. Some lube and yoga can get you out of a lot of tough situations.